Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another stream. Mercy, nice to see you again. The true connoisseur and Angel or Angle Anna, welcome into the stream. It's my first time seeing you guys. Hope you're all doing pretty well. Henrik, nice to see you again. Mr. Yada, as always. So, yesterday on stream, we watched a few videos. A big surprise, I know. Two talking about difficulty, and we spent a lot of time hashing over many of the topics relating to difficulty with just these two videos. And then we didn't get to finish or even start Miss Chalice's The Irony of Gideon the All-Knowing. So we only watched The Fate of the Forlorn after those two. So today I figured we can start off with The Irony of Gideon the All-Knowing by Miss Chalice, and then transitioning into some Dark Souls 3 lore with Honored Madman again with Pieces of the Past. And the thumbnail for this one says how Dark Souls 2 is connected to Dark Souls 3, which is always a fun topic and kind of a hot topic at times, because I know a lot of people in the fandom feel like they have conflicting emotions about how the three games connect to each other. Some people don't feel as though Dark Souls 3 ties back into Dark Souls 2 enough, and many people believe that it's kind of more the spiritual successor for Dark Souls 1 in a lot of ways. So, well, I don't necessarily feel quite the same, although there are definitely a lot more connections, I think, between Dark Souls 3 and Dark Souls 1 because, Miyazaki. But, setting that aside, I do think Dark Souls 3 does have a decent amount of connections to Dark Souls 2, so I am kind of excited to dive into this video with you all. So, Vacuum Zealot, nice to see you again. Do you think Moog wants to be the wife in his relationship? I'm not touching that question. Okiman, welcome in, as always. It's been a minute. Methoda? Hey LP, completely random question, but does the eyes on the inside slash insight pun work in Japanese? It's so flavorful, but feels like it only work in English. Yeah, unfortunately, that is an English only kind of pun, but it may have been intended for all we know, because the insight mechanic does have a picture of an eye on it. So, yeah, that's just one of those ones where I just don't know. Is Dark Souls 2 even a DS game? Yes. And then, of course, we've got some people like Captini in the chat who feel like Dark Souls isn't even part of the trilogy. Yesn't? Yeah. Scaleezy, nice to see you again. You felt like Dark Souls 2 didn't understand the story of Dark Souls? I feel like for some of its story beats, it was definitely thematically tied to the original game, but it also tried to do its own thing at times. So Dark Souls 2 falls into this problem of being titled Dark Souls because it's kind of, kind of garbage as a game, but it's limited by being called Dark Souls because it like borrowed all of the wrong lessons of Dark Souls, at least for the Scholar of the First Sin edition, and kind of ran with them, I guess. And the parts where it does do its own thing, I don't think it goes far enough to like establish itself differently from Dark Souls 1. But yeah, and some of the ties that it does have to Dark Souls 1, I think are very weak and contrived. And one of the examples that I constantly point to with that is how I feel the Lord Soul reincarnations is just kind of a garbage system. Well, I guess pun intended, because I was going to bring up like the rotten and he's just made of garbage essentially. Yeah. You still think DS2 would have been better as Demon Souls 2? I don't know how I feel about that. I feel like there'd need to be some drastic differences, but yeah. So anyway, like the people losing their mind and going hollow, I think Dark Souls 2 fleshes out the best, much better than Dark Souls 1 and 3 in terms of like having it be personalized due to characters like Lucatiel and even is his name Salden, the Crestfallen guy? I'm like blanking. The Crestfallen dude in Dark Souls 2. I think it's Salden. No, Salden's the merchant, isn't he? I'm just having a moment. Anyway, you feel like each Dark Souls takes the main theme of each game and goes on with it, making it its own, yet it adheres to the trilogy. You've only played DS3 though. Any recommendations to play after Elden Ring? So, um, yeah. It's kind of hard to give suggestions to people who've already played like Elden Ring, but if you've played Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne and its combat is closer to the speed of Dark Souls 3, so that would be a good transition. But Dark Souls 1, it's the first game in the trilogy. It's a hell of a lot slower than any of those games, but despite like its slowness and its jankiness, it's got a certain level of charm. I don't know how well that stands up for like new players today who are like going through it for their first time after playing other FromSoft games. I would maybe need to like watch streamers of people doing or streams of people doing that to like get a better vibe check. But DS1 holds a special place in my heart. BB is my favorite because it's me BB. But yeah, it's a good question. Nectarine, welcome back in. Malin is the merchant. Salden is the sad sack. Okay, I was right. I am tripping all over myself. You do think DS3 doesn't feel like an organic follow-up to DS2, but it works? Yeah, and that's probably a good way to describe it. And I think in many ways you can say the exact same thing about DS2 to DS1. Hendrix first was Bloodborne? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I would recommend Dark Souls 1 and or Demon Souls, but like Demon Souls doesn't really connect. It's so self-contained and it is a lot more bare bones. So, yeah, I would recommend Dark Souls 1, then Dark Souls 2, then Demon Souls cuz it'll actually feel better than Dark Souls 2 at least for me, and then Bloodborne as the final special treat and or Sekiro whenever you went. Actually do not play Sekiro before Dark Souls 2 or Bloodborne before Dark Souls 2 cuz at least in my experience the absolute speed of those games will just make Dark Souls 2 feel really, really, really bad. But of course, take what I say about Dark Souls 2 with a grain of salt. Not everybody hates it. Actually, a lot of people seem to love it. I'm just not one of those, and I'm kind of a well-known hater of DS2. Hey, Special Noob, welcome in. You like to think the great one, Slug Baby, grew up to be the old one of Demon Souls? That's funny. Yeah, just listen to the Aldia memes from YouTube and you get the best parts of Dark Souls 2. Alright, so let's go ahead and dive on into our first video with the irony of Gideon the All-Knowing. Actually, a surprising amount of Dark Souls chat in the chat right now. Which isn't a bad thing, it's just a little bit surprising that the game still have like this amount of relevance. Okay.
One of the most senior members of the Round Table Hold and acts as one of the main characters responsible for delivering world exposition to you. But how much of what he says can you trust? Let's start at the beginning. When you first arrive at the Round Table Hold, Gideon is one of the first people to greet you.
Oh, this is a rare occasion. I can't remember the last time a new Tarnished made their way to the Round Table. Very well. As your senior, I bid you welcome. It is safe here. You may let down your guard.
By his tone of surprise, we can assume that a new Tarnished walking into this secret hub is not a common occurrence. But Gideon mentions that he is of seniority, indicating some hierarchy here. Perhaps Gideon was one of the first to settle, or even the one responsible for establishing the Round Table Hold. Or maybe the use of senior is simply because he is older. In Zuli's video, you can see what Gideon looks like under his helmet. He is indeed an older looking fellow. Gideon's duplicitous nature becomes apparent as he switches between assurances of safety and warnings to remain vigilant.
You are a mere visitor to the Round Table. Nothing more.
I also like how Gideon's model is kind of small and scrawny to really go with the whole like bookish nerd type feel of the guy.
House guest. Yet to earn their keep. Remember your place, newcomer.
The existence of a ranking within the Round Table is reinforced here, with Gideon placing you at the bottom of the pecking order. Trying to talk to him further exposes the disdain he holds for your presence.
If you haven't anything to say, I would prefer you didn't pester me for attention. Try not to make a spectacle of yourself either. Or are you as irredeemably foolish as you appear?
You don't have a
A little bit of a through lines between Gideon and Sullivis there and their insults of the player. So Ava, welcome back to the stream. Nice to see you again. Okimin doesn't stand the Gideon slander, but Ava does. It's all good. Yeah, so Gideon is very fascinating to me because, as I'm sure like this video will go out and explain it in much detail, I am also of a Gideon doubter because there's kind of, I don't want to say like a lot of inconsistencies, but there's definitely been times where we're shown his omniscience isn't quite as omniscient as he would like others to believe at times. So anyway, yeah. Who asked it earlier? Oh yeah. So Henrik asked, "What's the hate about with Dark Souls 2? You always thought DS1 and 3 were the main souls, so you guess that's what the haters what you guess that's what the hate is about? But you don't know, gotta dive into the lore and play it to get eyes on the inside." So for me, most of the reason why I dislike Dark Souls 2 is due to game feeling. And the way that I pretty much always describe the game is that it feels like your character model is underwater. It's just very slow and sluggish. The animation times are very long, and it's a very deliberate game in a way that just didn't feel good to me. Like Dark Souls 1 is, a slow, deliberate game as well, but it felt like there was a weightiness to Dark Souls 1 that is not present in Dark Souls 2 because it feels like it's just really floaty, and I just really disliked it. And there's like a bunch of other stuff that goes into it, like the camera lock on is absolute garbage. In the Scholar of the First Sin edition, there's a lot of enemy ganks, especially at the beginning. Its open-ended nature is kind of similar to Dark Souls 1, where if you go down the graveyard immediately, you're gonna have a bad time. And that's not necessarily something entirely against Dark Souls 2, but if you go down like the difficult area first, it's in some ways it's more manageable, and it connects back into the other, like the area you eventually need to go anyway. It's just balanced kind of oddly, and like I just didn't like a lot of the encounters for the enemies. So as I said earlier, I feel like DS2 took like the wrong lessons of Dark Souls 1 by trying to make the game hard for difficulty's sake, but it just kind of ended up being a bit more tedious and lackluster. Oh yeah, and then the other big thing is because melee combat is so bad, it kind of funnels a lot of players into using ranged options, and ranged options in Dark Souls 2 is like kind of the best way to mitigate a lot of the bullcrap that it throws at you, but you kind of need to have a lot of game knowledge to do that to begin with. So I just feel like the melee players get the rough end of the stick, I guess. But anyway, I don't want to go on that too much longer, at least not during this video. The areas in DS2 are bland, even in places like New Londo. Oh, even places like New Londo and Lost Izalith look cool. So I'm not going to really harp too much on like the aesthetics of Dark Souls 2, because I do know some people enjoy that aspect of the game more because it is a bit more colorful. But yeah. Ava asks, didn't Gideon order for an entire massacre towards an Albinori village? Yeah. Allegedly, I have wondered whether or not the Omen Killer that's present there is actually Sullivis's puppet, but that's a little bit off topic. But anyway, Gideon doesn't ever really seem to deny the massacre, so there is still like a very good chance that he was behind it, because he just didn't really give a damn about Nefeli's reaction. So he just kind of uses others as his own pawns. True Connoisseur just doesn't enjoy the feel of DS2 also. Yeah, it's very clunky. He's very open about not actually being all-knowing to the player despite his title. He says his ultimate goal is to become all-knowing, implying he isn't there yet. Yeah, he also like flip-flops a little bit, which is, kind of fine, but it's just kind of funny that one of, the more reliable pieces of knowledge about the game isn't super reliable, which isn't to say that he doesn't say reliable things. It's just, well, let's go ahead and watch the video. Okay.
Purpose here, and therefore are not worthy of his time or respect. The theme of your usefulness to him will become a recurring motif throughout his story. To get on Gideon's good side and prove yourself worthy, he instructs you to claim a great rune, a shard from the Elden Ring, and then the two fingers will impart their wisdom onto you. Before we dive deeper into Gideon's deceit, here is a quick recap of the universe's structure, as it has been a while, and if anyone new here needs a summary. There is an abstract outer being called the Greater Will, a cosmic force considered a deity. You can't see it or communicate directly with it. Its only form of communication is with beings called the Two Fingers, envoys of the Greater Will who use the language of light. The only people who can interpret this cryptic language are the finger readers. When you get your first rune, the doors in the round table hold will open, where you can meet Enia, a finger reader, and a set of two fingers. Now, the reason I wanted to define this chain of communication is because it's inherently flawed. By the time the wisdom of the Greater Will reaches you, the Tarnished, it has
I was kind of hoping that it was going to be like a Triforce type thing going on, just because of the coloration initially. So, yeah, I kind of agree with what she's saying here, and I was going to bring it up as well that it's awfully convenient that the only things that can supposedly communicate with the Greater Will are only able, like, that it's awfully convenient for the fingers that nobody else can come into contact with the Greater Will directly, which kind of always raises a bunch of alarms in my mind that you have one critical point of failure in a communication line, in a communication chain, and then if you can't falsify that information, then you're just kind of screwed and have to take them at their own word. So that's really risky because they could be deceiving you and you'd have no way of knowing. They could be manipulating you, you have no way of knowing, or they could be telling the truth and you still have no way of knowing. So it just obviously relies on a lot of religious overtones of kind of like blind belief, which may have in part been why America eventually made the switch with Radagon, but that part, what I just said right there, is a little bit of speculation, so just to be clear about that. Giving religion vibes, yeah. It's a game of telephone, yeah. Welcome into the stream, Dead. Yeah, going back. The Greater Will said you owe me $50. Trust. It's for the Church of the Two Fingers.
Traversed through 3 intermediaries. It's a game of cosmic telephone, with each link in the chain adding its own layer of interpretation. Can you trust the accuracy of the messages received after they've undergone this convoluted journey? No, of course not. Keep that in mind for now. When you receive your first rune, Gideon finally acknowledges you as a Round Table member, but there's more to his welcome than meets the eye.
I bid you welcome. As a true member of the Round Table, I am known as Gideon Ofnir. As a Tarnished who wishes to stand before the Elden Ring and become Elden Lord, I am accumulating knowledge. To be all-knowing.
Here, Gideon reveals that he is also...
So, Scalazy kind of brings up a good point that it's kind of that there's 2 points of failure between the fingers and the finger readers, which might be true, but I am also a little bit curious where, what's his face? Goldmask kind of fits into that, whether or not he could also presumably interpret the... Well, I guess there's Corrin as well, because, like, Corrin literally... Well, man, that whole situation's really weird, because Corrin, who is wearing a blindfold, is somehow able to see or perceive the wriggling of Goldmask's finger to retranslate it, or, like, to write it down as his scribe. So, could Goldmask presumably do something similar with the fingers? But, yeah, so maybe it isn't entirely dependent upon the finger readers. I don't think there's anything that says that specifically. I might be misremembering, though. So she might have said something like slightly wrong or not fully true, but I don't remember the details, to be honest. If anybody in chat has it, feel free to link it. Okay.
To be all-knowing.
Here, Gideon reveals that he is also trying to become Elden Lord. And if you realize the implications of this, that means that Gideon is not just an ally guiding you to become Elden Lord, he is also your competition. Despite appearing forthcoming with crucial information, Gideon subtly manipulates you to further his agenda.
The inheritors of the Great Runes, the Shard Bearers. We of the Round Table know the location of 5 of them, including the one you defeated.
He tells you.
So in some ways, this is going to be a bit of a funny comparison. Bro, what is this? Is this just like on her video? Or maybe this is like... Okay, that's weird. Anyway, yeah, so this is going to be a little bit of a weird comparison that I'll make between Gideon, but in some ways, he's kind of like Patches, where he will try to gank you and kill you, but if you stop him, he's like, it didn't work. It's all fair. You forgive me, right? We're fast friends by now. So yeah. I thought I was going to say something else about that. Yeah. So at least Gideon is pretty forthright about you two kind of being competitors to a degree. And sure, he tries to kill you, but I mean, we also kill him. So I guess it kind of evens out in the end, doesn't it? Gideon is proof you should never trust anyone from Yorkshire.
The names and locations of 5 shard bearers, demigods with great runes needed to repair the Elden Ring. So if Gideon knows who has the runes, why doesn't he just get them for himself? He is trying to become Elden Lord, right? Well, in the nicest possible way, and I don't know why I'm being nice to Gideon, he is a dick. Gideon is wise, but not intelligent. He has worldly knowledge, yes. He has a vast library, he has an entire network of spies, he is our primary source of exposition about the world and the demigod family tree, but that's all it is, information.
So this is just outright slander that is 1000% not true, because why the hell else would he spam so many glintstone sorceries at us if he didn't have a high int stat? Get wrecked.
Knowledge is power, but how can one claim that power if they never even leave the Round Table hold?
I'll trade your findings for a hidden treasure or a long-lost right, known only to me. We both desire to stand before the Elden Ring and become Elden Lord. As such, I hope we are compelled to work together.
Gideon sees you as a pawn, expendable for only one purpose: collect great runes for him. As an incentive, he teases you with the unknown locations of a few other shard bearers, like a carrot dangling from a string in front of you. This calculated move is Gideon's way of enticing you to feed him information in exchange for exclusive spells. One of these...
And I do wish it was made a little bit more explicit how the handling of great runes is meant to interact with the Tarnished, because Ania talks about having not seen 2 great runes together since a very, very long time ago. And does that imply that Gideon has at least 2 rune shards? I mean, maybe, because that's kind of like the prerequisite to... Wait, no, you only need the 1 to open the doors. But anyway, at least Gideon presumably has 1. And then the question becomes, how does he get it? Is this kind of an inter-universal parallel world style hub? I think so, because it's just kind of got a little bit of a shared nature with something like the Nexus in Demon Souls, and to a lesser dream, the Hunter's Nightmare or the Hunter's Dream in Bloodborne. So, yeah. Where are all these Tarnished getting their great runes that Gideon is like, I'm not going to welcome anyone until they get a great rune? Of course, that could just be Gideon being Gideon, but there's some like weird other stuff going along with his quest that suggests he is also defeating bosses, because if you defeat Millennia, he'll get the Scarlet Ionian like bloom incantation. So maybe he is also killing bosses the same times that we are, or maybe he's literally just like harvesting their remains as some kind of a creep, which wouldn't be terribly off-brand for him either. The Gideon slander's true. He has all those spells, but the defense of a noodle. He's actually pretty tanky, to be honest, compared to like a lot of other sorcerers. Gideon has a vast amount of wealth and knowledge and can understand the complex secrets of the world, but lacks the capacity to see how his monstrous actions would come back to bite him. Yeah. Who did Vike kill for the gold great runes? Oh, where did they go? Cotton Eye Joe. Wait, there was the... I didn't even see those. Hedrick. That's the only way the other tarnished having great runes makes sense to you, but it's hard to get, and the game doesn't make it clear. Yeah, it does. It could have been expanded on or clarified ever so slightly more, and it would have been fine. But that's what you get when you ever ask for a direct answer in a FromSoft game.
Spells is called Lord's Divine Fortification, an incantation
I like her little graphics here.
taught to Gideon the All-Knowing by the Two Fingers. This is a crucial sentence, revealing that Gideon has been a student of the Two Fingers. Gideon gained true knowledge after his long exchange with the Two Fingers, discovering all had been broken long ago, that the trembling fingers bent with age, and the Erdtree itself were no exception. Through his intimate studying with and of the Two Fingers, he too discovered that something wasn't right. Whether he concluded that the fingers were unreliable because they were senile, bent with age, or broken, as in having a broken connection to the greater will, he concluded not to trust them. He even makes a comment to us about their redundancy.
The Two Fingers lost their purpose a long, long time ago.
The significance of this revelation ties back to the broader theme of information reliability, and the true nature of the greater will is unveiled when you reach the Erdtree's entrance, only to find it blocked by impenetrable thorns. This unforeseen obstacle shocks Ennia and the Fingers, disrupting the plan for you to meet Queen Marika inside the tree. The Two Fingers then try to commune with the greater will for guidance. However, this time it is not a short or straightforward process.
But thousands, if not tens of thousands, of moons must first pass.
That is an excessive amount of time to receive an answer. Why is this time different from all the other times? When you previously met with Ennia, the Fingers would respond instantly, giving guidance, allegedly, straight from the greater will. But this time...
That could have also been guidance that had been like left behind or something that they knew about, but maybe the greater will just doesn't respond to surprises very well to begin with, or anything like that. And there's so many other ways you could read this, like the Two Fingers not actually connecting with the greater will. Maybe it's a connection between the other fingers, but the other fingers are kind of dead now. But we do eventually get that description that mentions the fingers were bent and broken long ago. So it is curious how these two's relationship is meant to play out in relation to the greater will, and or her knowledge of like the Fingers' knowledge, and whether or not the Fingers are like really communing with her directly. I don't know. It just very vague. 10,000 moons is 27.4 years. If I remember correctly, the Japanese is like slightly different, where it isn't quite as long, but it's still like a long time. Or it might just be like figurative language. I would need to double check. What was it? Renounce the demigods? Let me...
Giving guidance to receive an answer.
How will you ever manage the weights? Okay. Gotta wait for it to load. Getting a little ahead of myself. It happens. Where are we at? Oh yeah, so instead of just moons, it's the character for sun. So it'll be tens of thousands of days. So, I mean, essentially the same thing, so it's kind of interesting that they went with moons here. Okay. Where is my chat? Okay, there it is.
Why is this time different from all the other times? When you previously met with Enia, the fingers would respond instantly, giving guidance, allegedly, straight from the Greater Will. But this time, it's going to be years and years. As I mentioned, you do not receive information directly from the source, the Greater Will. You can't see it, you can't hear it. The Greater Will isn't tangible. So, how do you know it's still here? In the very first cutscene of the game, the narrator tells us,
"A war from which no lord arose. A war leading to abandonment by the Greater Will."
This revelation challenges the authenticity of the guidance provided by the two fingers throughout the game. The Greater Will has abandoned the lands between after seeing the disarray that occurred because of the shattering. All that is left of its influence, but because the Greater Will isn't visible, no one would likely know that it.
Do the sentences just get spliced there? Let me back up.
Seeing the disarray that occurred because of the shattering. All that is left of its influence, but because the Greater Will isn't.
Yeah, it looks like a bit of an editing error or something like that.
Visible, no one would likely know that it had turned its back on this world, apart from the fingers. All this time, the fingers have been giving guidance to us, but in reality, they are frauds. Enia even translates a sentence that directly contradicts what we heard in the intro cinematic.
But the Greater Will has not abandoned the realm, nor the life that inhabits it.
Of course, the fingers would tell us, no, don't worry, the Greater Will is still here to try and misdirect us, but as Enia revealed, trying to consult them directly will take a lifetime, which doesn't add up. I think.
And then, of course, one could argue about the canonicity of the intro cinematic, because it could just be talking about a specific point in time. I want to double check what the intro actually says, but I don't remember what it says. Elden Ring, arise now, ye tarnished. Ye tarnished. A war leading to abandonment by the Greater Will. Yeah, I could see that. But I guess the question becomes whether or not the entire lands between was abandoned, or the demigods specifically because they failed. Because it also says Queen Marika the Eternal is nowhere to be found, but I mean, just look in the tree. I don't know. So how seriously should we take that intro, I think, is also a pertinent question to this. So, not that I entirely disagree with what she's saying, but I don't think it's quite as ironclad as it could be. And SNX, welcome back to the stream. Yeah, and Special Noob said they thought it turned its back on the demigods, not the whole world. And of course, it could just be figurative language as well, which is, always a little bit annoying, but... I mean, not always, but you get what I mean. Yeah, you don't think the narrator is omniscient? Yeah, I think it is also worth noting that when you see the death of Godwin, you don't really see Ronnie dead and lying next to him either. So there are some artistic liberties taken with the intro, or when Ronnie and Godwin died at the same time, they were literally in different places, which is possible, but just not fully explained either. Yeah, that's kind of how I feel, Loki. The intro isn't an omnipotent narrator like DS1. It's like a guy giving a rally. Yeah.
The Greater Will essentially gave the fingers a script to rehearse on directing suitable tarnish to restore the Golden Order. You have not been.
Oh yeah, and I don't mean to pause it so often, but one thing that is always interested me about Gideon's dialogue to the Tarnished when they first meet, he's follow the words that the fingers gave you when you first came, which is kind of funny because you technically don't have the guidance that was given to you by the fingers, sort of, although it is kind of potentially in the flavor text of, I think, the lowest level rune, or maybe on the Memory of Grace. I would need to double check, but anyway.
curse on directing suitable tarnish to restore the Golden Order, you have not been having a back and forth conversation with the Greater Will. It's closer to listening to a voicemail message. So that explains why the Fingers no longer have a script to refer to when things go rogue. They call out to the Greater Will for help. But as we have established, it is nowhere to be found. Their cries for help echo into nothingness, locking them in a dormant state until they receive a reply they will never get. The status of other Two Fingers supports this theory. That's right, the ones in the Round Table Hold are not the only ones that exist. At the top of each divine tower, you can find a pair of Two Fingers. However, there is something different about these. Cracked, withered, and collapsed. Dead. If you know anything about Rani's questline, you will understand that the Two Fingers can't be killed that easily. You go on this whole quest to locate an ancient weapon that is the only item capable of harming them, as Rani wants to eliminate hers so she can be free. This weapon is locked up deep underground in a forgotten city for centuries, so it is unlikely to be responsible for the demise of all those fingers atop the towers. There is a corresponding divine tower for each great rune you collect from the shard bearers. You go there to unlock different effects that each rune provides, and if each tower corresponds to each demigod, then so do each set of fingers. Based on Rani's quest, she had a set of Two Fingers meant to be her advisor, so maybe her siblings had the same. However, when the shattering...
So that's kind of an interesting thing that I didn't think about quite this way for whatever reason, but I have always noticed that it's strange that the Amber Egg rune, Great Rune of the Unborn, doesn't require its benediction to be unlocked by visiting Two Fingers. And maybe the Two Fingers for that could have been like Rani's Two Fingers specifically, because when you go to the top of the Lyrian Divine Tower, there is the lack of Two Fingers there where Rani's body is. So maybe those two are supposed to be related, but not every Great Rune has an associated Two Fingers with it. Well, hold on. Well, that's kind of not true, because some Two Fingers have multiple Great Runes, as evidenced by the Omen Twins, which is interesting as well. Because I have wondered whether or not the Two Fingers benediction is equivalent to how the Tarnished die when they produce their mending runes. So did the Two Fingers die to create like the Elden Ring, essentially? Or like the shards of the Elden Ring? It's so weird that you kill the demigods to get their god shards, essentially, but then they're not activated until you go up the Divine Towers. I do hope that there is a little bit more expanded on that relationship in the DLC or future content, whether or not there's ever a sequel or anything like that. Who has Godwin's rune? You can't remember. So Godwin would not have had the rune. So what had happened was Godwin died before the Elden Ring got shattered, so the runes shouldn't have been inherited by him because the Elden Ring was still whole at that time. And same thing with Rani, although I do know that some people believe that Rani should have had a Great Rune, but she really shouldn't, because she died before the shattering, unless she happened to proclaim one after the fact. But if so, it's not like we ever really get a true Great Rune from her. We get one of the fragments of destined death that she used to slay her body and Godwin's body, but those were also removed before the Shattering War, and so they're kind of like their own thing for all intents and purposes. Yeah, and Kinman said it as well. And also welcome back to the stream. So yeah, True Connoisseur said Rani cast away her rune, so we're told anyway. And of course, that's Gideon who tells us that, so I wouldn't be surprised if Miss Chalice brings that up later on, because he is not quite as all-knowing as he purports himself to be. What is the point of the towers if there were no runes before the shattering? That's a very good question, isn't it? And we don't really know. Some people like to think that they all could have connected to Fair Missoula. There has to be some kind of like spatial connection to some degree. Maybe not has to, because they're all kind of got these meteorites embedded within them. And or they might have been like platforms from which the fingers could commune with the greater will, for all we know. Two Hit says Ronnie's kind of in a weird space because she was supposedly a part of the small council. What is after she died? So she show up as the doll? So that council, I don't necessarily think is, really representative of like the post-shattering council. I mean, it probably is to some small degree because like there was the whole quote unquote sovereign alliance of demigods and whatnot to consider, but I feel like Morgott's cutscene with him talking to the chairs representing the other demigods is just more symbolism than anything like super informative, despite some people thinking like it's, super informative, because there are a couple missing seats for Moog and Morgott himself, if you don't count the Throne of Elden Lord as kind of a Morgott taking it for himself. But anyway, it's not the biggest of deals. Maybe the towers are involved in the shattering somehow. They do form a circle around the piece of land that has been shattered from the rest of the lands between. And that's another popular thought, that there could have been a, Atlantis type situation, or maybe a Farum Azula type situation in the middle of the lands between. And despite that, they are not like equidistant from the Erdtree. So if they are like containing a certain area, that area is definitely not present in the now times. I didn't want to say present again. All right, I'm going to go back to the video now.
Shattering occurred, the family descended into chaos and greed, all vying for power. All of their two fingers went to consult the Greater Will on how to proceed, but as we established in the opening cutscene, this is when the Greater Will abandoned them all. So all these fingers got locked in the same dormant state that the fingers in the Round Table hold are now in. They have been stuck like this for years, which explains why they are dried up and perished when you find them. I hope that helps show the current state of the fingers and their deceit. So what about the Erdtree rejecting you? So those thorns that prevented you from passing are initially thought to be from the Erdtree itself. Hence, Enya tells us,
the Erdtree has burned you.
However, if you remember the description from that unique...
Okay, I just really enjoyed the little closed captions there.
Tree has burned you.
However,
a wicked burn.
If you remember the description from that unique Gideon spell earlier, you will recall it mentioning that the fingers bent with age, and the Erdtree itself were no exception. This suggests an additional explanation. The Erdtree, like the fingers, is aging and dying. Clues about the Erdtree's deteriorating state are found in its seeds, a phenomenon never witnessed before the shattering. The Erdtree was once perfect and eternal, and thus was it believed that Erdtree seeds could not exist, until one day, when the Elden Ring was shattered, these seeds flew from the Erdtree, scattering across the various lands, as if life itself knew that its end had come. The seed scattering after the Elden Ring shattering symbolizes the acknowledgement of the Erdtree's impending demise. This biological instinct aligns with the real-life behavior of certain plants, known as annuals, that drop seeds at the end of their lifespan. The Erdtree devised a strategy to secure the continuation of its lineage through self-sowing. So if the Erdtree is dying, if not already dead, it's unlikely to have grown thorns of its own. This is supported by Enya and the fingers being surprised when you inform them. Their reaction indicates something like this never happens, because it's not the tree's doing, but Radagon's, the one inside the tree. As a quick summary, Radagon is trying to repair the Elden Ring after Marika shattered it. He wants things to return to how they were, with the Golden Order still the governing principle of the lands between. So he summoned thorns to cover the entranceway to stop anyone from interfering. Just as a heads up, this is a theory, as it's not explicitly confirmed anywhere to be Radagon's doing definitely, but the pattern and shape of the thorns match the same pattern you can find on statues of Radagon. It's part.
So yeah, I definitely appreciate her making it clear that it's, a theory and not explicitly stated by the text. And that's something I probably would have overlooked because of just how well supported it is. Although I was kind of like in my own head wondering whether or not the little squares of the like YouTube thumbnails that are down here is from her potentially like taking somebody else's footage and then giving them credit there. So I was just not paying as much attention as I should be, to be honest.
Part of his symbology, this is corroborated by the item Radagon's Scar Seal, which has that same crosshatch pattern, and by seal, this refers to a design or stamp symbolizing authenticity. Therefore, Radagon's symbol is this, and the thorns in front of the Erdtree signify the same. When you clicked on this video,
Yeah, and as Two Hit points out, the lattice on the barrier is similar to the ones that you could find in Raya Lucaria, or like the Raya Lucarian seal outside Lusat's, makeshift prison in the little glintstone mine or whatever you want to call it. So, yeah.
said it would be about Gideon, and I promise I'm returning to him in a second. The significance of the thorns is also essential when considering Morgott, an important character whose last words shed light on the thorn's purpose.
Tarnished. Thou art but a fool. The Erdtree wards off all who deign approach.
Morgott's denial of entry to the Erdtree implies that the thorns are not exclusively for you, the Tarnished, but for anyone seeking to usurp Radagon as Elden Lord.
None may claim the title of Elden Lord. Thy deeds shall be met with failure, just as I.
So, Mr. Yadization has a really good question of the English for the seals calls Marika and Radagon's runes Elden runes instead of Great runes. Is it similar in Japanese? I don't remember off the top of my head. I think so. I mean, I assume I would have looked at it and definitely remembered if there's a discrepancy, but maybe I haven't really paid attention to it. Source seal. All right. Then Elden rune. Yeah, no, Elden rune. So yeah, it's definitely what's the word? Equivalent? Similar? I don't know. Between the two languages. So not really a problem of translation / localization. Yeah, good question. So yeah, I vaguely remember looking at that now. All right. True Connoisseur is very interested to see if the content about Radagon proactively warning the citizens of the lands between about the Tarnished inevitable return will show up in the DLC. Yeah, there's some really interesting cut things between 1.0, especially in like the Chinese version, that definitely paint the story of the picture in a very different light. Special Noob always wished you could tell Morgott, I did it, I am the Elden Lord, because he sounds so despairing here. So, yeah, I think part of the reason why Morgott despaired is because of his love for the Erdtree. He probably could have become Elden Lord if he had the desire to burn it, but he didn't because he loved the Erdtree, which is kind of a little bit messed up by localization there. Like his Great Rune, what does it say in English? Great Rune. Oh no. Maybe Love Not. That'd probably be faster. Okay. Yeah. This one's so awkward. Though born one of the graceless omen, Morgott took it upon himself to become the Erdtree's protector. He loved not in return, for he was never loved, but nevertheless love it he did. Oh god, I just hate that line. It's so it's so needlessly convoluted. So the Japanese does also say like the omen are graceless, which is kind of an interesting, similarity. Or not like saying it that way is kind of like misphrasing it, but I mean, it's very fascinating to me that the omen specifically are called graceless. But so even though Morgott was born amongst or as a graceless omen, he conducted himself as the protector of the Erdtree, and it's not because he was loved. Oh, man, it's kind of difficult to articulate this in English, to be fair, so I understand why this is a little bit awkward. But anyway, the gist of it is, the reason he acted as the guardian of the Erdtree wasn't because he was loved, as in like given the grace of the Erdtree, but just because he loved it, essentially. So yeah, it was not because he was loved by the tree. It's just because he loved the tree that he was its protector. You're still mad they're called tarnished and not disgraced?
Words that will foreshadow our later encounter with Gideon. Now we're going to fast forward a bit here. To gain access to Tree, you need to burn Tree, but not with normal fire, special fire. Go to location of special fire, kill Guardian, use Melina as kindling to start fire, go to space-time pocket dimension, take rune that makes everyone die again. You are now ready to become Elden Lord, or at least in theory. As you approach the Erdtree again, a surprising encounter awaits with Gideon. Leaving the safety of the Round Table hold, Gideon's intentions become clear. He's not there to wish you well on your journey, but to obstruct your path to the Elden Ring.
Alright, just because now it's bothering me as far as like my pedantry goes. So, well, disgraced is a pretty good pun in English. There is a little bit more to the idea of tarnishing that is more at present in the Japanese, and it just doesn't super work in English that well, in that the term used for it is iro aseru, which is to like be drained of color essentially, or like have a color fade, and that's kind of what tarnishing means, although in English it has like more metal connotations, which is a pretty good like parallel that it would have between like metals potentially in runes being gold. So there is a kind of a good comparable imagery that accompanies that in both languages, but calling it disgraced, I think, would lose that important connection between like gold and colors, which might also pertain to things like the somber smithing stones and like the faded Erd leaf flowers, although those ones might be scarlet rot, I don't remember exactly. But anyway, that is a very, very, very big important theme in the game, and yeah, you would just lose a little bit of that if it was called disgraced instead. So, you giveth and you taketh away. Desaturated, yeah, a little bit. Gold doesn't even tarnish, which is exactly why it's important that they are tarnished. True Connoisseur says, tarnished may even be an original term, and the Japanese may have been tailored to match it. Given that Martin worked on development early on, hard to know what was his and what wasn't. Exactly, and that's true. But I would say even if tarnished was an English thing first, I do think the idea was probably expanded upon a little bit more in the Japanese as far as the visual, not visual, but literary imagery goes in that. But yeah, good comment there.
Ah, I knew you'd come to stand before the Elden Ring, to become Elden Lord. What a sad state of affairs. I commend your spirit, but alas, none shall take the throne.
Like Morgott, Gideon echoes the same sentiment. No one can become Elden Lord, and he is here to ensure that it stays that way. Gideon is prepared to fight you to the death for this. This may come as a surprise from an NPC you thought was your ally. You have been compiling your knowledge together. Calling him a friend may be a bit of a stretch, but as far as you knew, Gideon wanted to become Elden Lord and was helping you at the same time. And because of this, it is strange because Gideon doesn't say this is why he is fighting you. It's not a Highlander, there can be only one moment. He says that no one can become Elden Lord, including himself. Amidst the confrontation, Gideon discloses crucial information.
Queen Marika has high hopes for us, that we continue to struggle. Unto eternity.
This revelation becomes the foundation for Gideon's perspective and his decision to stand between you, the Tarnished, and the throne. He understands that Marika wants everyone to remain in a state of struggle forever. But how did he come to know this? We learn from the description of his armor, the All-Knowing set. Knowledge begins with the recognition of one's ignorance, the realization that the search for knowledge is unending. But when Gideon glimpsed into the will of Queen Marika, he shuddered in fear. At the end, that should not be.
And yeah, I was, beside myself waiting to bring this up, so I'm glad that she immediately went into it. And I know I've gotten questions in the past whether or not this description is, pretty much equivalent to the Japanese, and it is, especially at the end. That should not be. It's a pretty faithful translation. So, yeah. I should double check because it might be like a little bit clearer that it's kind of like a rhetorical or like talking about the perspective of Gideon rather than being quite as factual. But generally speaking, like the final sentiment is definitely there.
Gideon saw something that changed his perspective, Marika's will. As detailed...
Sorry, I want to back up just to All-Knowing set. I was afraid of that. Okay.
Something that changed his perspective, Marika's will. As detailed in a previous video of mine, Marika's will involves the Tarnished growing stronger to defeat her demigod children, collect the Great Rune pieces, kill her captor, and ultimately repair the Elden Ring for a better world. However, the extent to which Marika shared this information with the inhabitants of the lands between remains to be determined.
In Marika's own words, then, after thy death, I will give back what I once claimed, return to the lands between, wage war, and brandish the Elden Ring, grow strong in the face of death.
Alarmed by the sinister interpretation of Marika's words, particularly the idea of an eternal training arc involving death, Gideon chose to turn away from changing the world and instead immersed himself in study. This is where we arrive at the first theory of Gideon's finale. Gideon doesn't like change. Gideon is ever consuming knowledge. He must become all-knowing, yet he says,
The pursuit of knowledge is without end, for knowledge is never a thing complete.
Amidst his quest for perpetual enlightenment, he falls prey to a fallacy, the belief that the pursuit of knowledge is never complete. This fallacy becomes more profound when Gideon interprets Marika's will about struggling far too literally. Gideon envisions a fate of eternal struggle akin to his eternal pursuit of knowledge. This perspective is challenged with your arrival. You are someone who is not happy with accepting an eternal struggle. You want to become Elden Lord and will let nothing stop you, not information, prophecy, or logic. And Gideon envied you for that. The comfort he found in accepting an eternal struggle is juxtaposed with your refusal to succumb to it. He wasn't...
So yeah, I'm not sure I have like the same takeaway from that, which is perfectly fine. These are just going to be differences of opinion. And this one is like, Gideon's MO is still like very open to interpretation. So I don't want to also give off the impression that my opinion here is, somehow inherently superior than Miss Chalice's or vice versa. So just to be very clear about that. But the way that I've kind of been looking at Gideon for a while is that the whole line about him shuddering in fear at the end that should not be is kind of important, because if you end the age, I guess he's just kind of fearing an end. And Marika herself also doesn't want an end, which is why she's like Marika the Eternal, and why the Tarnished, to a certain extent, would want to struggle for, or she would want the Tarnished to struggle for eternity, because that's just kind of a perpetuation of life. So both Gideon and Marika want an eternal something. So Gideon might want an eternal quest or search for knowledge, whereas Marika might want an eternal struggle to live. And he might be misinterpreting Marika's will slightly. We don't exactly know, because I think America wants an actual end to the age, which is why Gideon shudders and talks about the end that should not be. So, in my estimation, the line at the end that should not be, that might be talking more specifically about Gideon's mentality than America's specifically. And that's kind of where individual interpretation comes more into play there. So hopefully I was clear about that. All knowing MFs when they know something that they didn't want to know. I know, right? It's very on brand that a character named the All-Knowing would know something that tortures and condemns him. Yeah. One of my favorite Easter eggs or like headcanons about the Hitchhiker's Guide at the end, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and like the restaurant at the end of the universe, like that whole series of books, is that Marvin the robot should presumably know the answer to the ultimate question in the world, and or well the answer to life, the universe, and everything. And he should also presumably know the question to it because he said he's able to read it off of the brain scans of Arthur Dent. And so in my mind, I like to rationalize the reason that he is so eternally depressed is because he does know both the question and the answer. So anyway, not too important, but that's just kind of what comes to mind when I think about like omniscient characters and things like that. Eternal suffering is very Catholic, and Mother Teresa of her, indeed. Very, very Catholic indeed. You think the struggle comment needs to be paired with what Gideon says when he dies? A man cannot kill a god. Gideon realizes that Marika wants the Tarnished to essentially help her commit suicide by proxy. Yeah, the Hugh Quest suggests it, and then he concludes it's impossible. So I don't necessarily think that he thinks it's impossible, like not literally. I think he's just kind of in denial, essentially. Henrik says it well. You're in the know, right? Yeah. Ironic.
Willing to go headfirst into the unknown, he had to prepare and know exactly what would happen at every stage. The extent of this envy is palpable in his last words.
I know in my bones a Tarnished cannot become a lord. Not even you. A man cannot kill a god.
In his bones, not his books. This suggests a belief devoid of empirical evidence.
That is a wonderful observation. I really appreciate that. Two Hit says, you never thought of Gideon as literally all-knowing, but more of a moniker pointing to his attitude and behavior, and that and also his role as spy master. Yeah, I think that's very fair, but unfortunately I have also seen people who take a lot of what he says at his word, essentially. So I really enjoy having like these kind of deep dives where they may make people who didn't initially question what Gideon had to say and may be more prone to doing so after a video like this.
A departure from Gideon's usual reliance on books and knowledge, Gideon's lack of supporting evidence reveals his weakness in applying the knowledge he amassed. There is no concrete basis for the assumption that a Tarnished cannot become Elden Lord. This reluctance stems from Gideon's fear that your success would undermine his life's work and achievements. He is a man ever consumed by knowledge, coupled with resistance to change when faced with the unknown and unexpected. He just doesn't want it to be true. That is one interpretation of the events. Another is more simple. Gideon is the antagonist.
Whoa.
From the moment you arrived at the Round Table, he took pleasure in ridiculing you, until he notices your acquisition of a great rune, at which point he covertly becomes your rival, using you, as I warned at the beginning of this video. He told you where to find the runes, having you do his bidding, then intercepted you at the pivotal last moment. Gideon's intentions with the runes are up to interpretation, whether he sought to steal them for himself, hide them to maintain the status quo, or follow a different agenda altogether. However, the user-manipulator theory gains support from Gideon's treatments of other characters in the Elden Ring world. Ensha, a character guarding Gideon's room, is an example of an instrument in Gideon's schemes. When you collect a piece of a secret medallion triggering Ensha's attack, it is theorized that Gideon ordered Ensha to retrieve this medallion from your cold, dead hands. When you defeat him, Gideon's reaction is rather lackluster.
Ensha is slain and gone. Finished. Forevermore.
Gideon's apparent lack of distress upon Ensha's defeat suggests a pattern of using individuals until they are no longer of use.
Yeah, absolutely. I personally couldn't really read the series of events any other way that Gideon ordered it, and it just didn't go to plan, and he just kind of like shrugged it off right in front of your face. Jay Bowden, welcome back to the stream. You don't think Gold Mask is undead? You think he's really skinny like the fasting Buddha? I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, if he's tarnished, he's kind of undead like us, but undead, at least in Elden Ring, is certainly somewhat different than in like Dark Souls, for example. But yeah, just in general, I do agree that he has a lot of symbolic ties to the kind of like asceticism that you'd find in some forms of Buddhism. Special Noob says, I suppose if you reorder everything as Elden Lord, then his knowledge becomes obsolete. So yeah, I don't know if it's that entirely, and his whole reticence about us becoming Elden Lord is kind of questionable. I think ultimately he chooses to abandon becoming Elden Lord because there's something about the current age that he wants to sustain, and if he cannot become Elden Lord, then nobody else can become Elden Lord. So his change of heart is his kind of essential act with the authority of an Elden Lord who's just kind of already made their decision in his own mind, I guess. So that would just be how I would reconcile some of his mentality might come into play with things. Albigade, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. Welcome into the stream. Overall elements of this has always puzzled you. Maybe Gideon put his hopes on somehow putting the order to rights with his knowledge and realized it was impossible when he realized America's ultimate goal is the destruction of the current age without any particular guaranteed plan to fix the order. There is no simple solution. Obvious to us, but yeah. So yeah, I think that's a pretty good read on things there as well. Gotta love the no violence spell on the round table, huh? He can't do anything and he knows it. I mean, you say that, but how the hell did Ensha attack us in a fake shadowy round table then? And the funny thing about that version of the round table hold where Ensha attacks you, if I remember correctly, I could be misremembering this, it is not actually a one-to-one same version of the round table hold that we go into, because if you like screw around and just like go off to one of the side areas with the twin husks, the paintings on the wall are different. So it might be more equivalent to the Lanedell version of the round table hold. But I would need to double check because it's been a while since I've done that. Gideon likely knows how it works and subverts it, maybe.
The same fate befalls Nephili, Gideon's adopted daughter. If you follow her quest, there is a point where she hits rock bottom, devastated by Gideon's cold and callous methods, namely the slaughter of an innocent village. And what does her father do in response to this? Disown her for displaying a backbone.
So I had no further use for her.
Gideon's track record becomes evident. He uses people until they serve their purpose, make a mistake, or gain autonomy. Your final confrontation with Gideon marks the moment of you now being finally cast aside. Now, if you're aware of the boss order in Elden Ring, you know that Gideon's fight doesn't occur immediately before the last boss, Radagon in the Tree. There is one more. Godfrey, aka Horalu, aka the first Elden Lord, aka not a pushover. And Gideon, no offense, full offense, is not a warrior. So if he did...
I was gonna say, Gideon also apparently just lets him walk through? I don't know.
...plan to gank us on the way to the end of the game, how on earth did he plan to take on Godfrey? Use someone else. You will discover Nephili is a summon outside Godfrey's boss room. So a possible explanation for this is that Gideon sent Nephili ahead to take care of Godfrey for him. He is again.
That's a pretty neat theory. I never considered it that way, but I like it. I don't know if that fully works out, but yeah, it's believable to some degree. Although I do find it a bit questionable because I feel like Nefeli would have turned her back on Gideon at this point in her quest if he did it completely, because she doesn't come here unless you complete her quest, obviously. So maybe this idea doesn't fully track, but nonetheless, I still like it because it's neat and plausible from a certain point of view. Gideon also has another lackey he sends to the slaughter, Henricus. Yeah, the dude who got in the volcano manor. Gideon, Gendo, Ikari, all terrible fathers are the same. Get in the Erdtree, Cav. Cavg.
Again, using people to further his goal. But what about his last words? If you view Gideon as the big bad bully, you could consider this as nothing more than an insincere comment. As an antagonist, his assertion that a tarnished cannot become a lord is nothing more than an attemptful, hurtful statement meant to undermine your confidence, rather than a comment on the task's impossibility. If it is meant to be a shot at your ego, this would add some sense to what he said at the beginning of the fight.
Ah, I knew you'd come.
Like, of course, Gideon, we literally talked about how we were coming here. This isn't some grand reveal that only you figured out. It's an attempt to assert intellectual dominance over you. This theory is quite surface level. It views Gideon as a classic scheming bad guy with no depth to his words, simply bluffs and bravado. And then we arrive at the final theory. Gideon is scared. When Gideon peered into Marika's will, he didn't interpret it as an endless struggle, as suggested in the first theory. Instead, he saw a void, an end to the world order as he knew it. This revelation instilled fear into Gideon, as he witnessed a scenario where the Golden Order was not restored. He shuddered in fear at the end that should not be. Gideon witnessed a cataclysmic end. He saw you killing Radagon and Morgott. That's why he says a man cannot kill a god. It's an exclamation grounded not in certainty, but in disbelief that such an extraordinary feat could occur. Something like that had never happened before. Gideon had never read or studied anything like it. No one ever wanted nor dared to do such a sinful task. Under normal circumstances, a man could not slay a godlike being like Radagon and Morgott. Gideon's reaction implies that he might not have comprehended the process or the reasons behind your actions. It's unlikely he didn't understand why, and this is why he goes to stop you. It's a decision based on fear. He saw an end that he couldn't fathom, fear of the unknown. An ironic twist for the self-proclaimed all-knowing, who now...
Well, also, he's always in pursuit of unknown knowledge to learn more, so it is very ironic that he gets scared of that version of the unknown. But yeah, so far I'm definitely appreciating how she's offering different perspectives for Gideon's motives right here, and I wasn't sure she was going to do that initially, so it's nice to have the multiple takes there. I appreciate it. Soulborn Machine, welcome into the stream. You say, check out Scumnut. I'm familiar with Scumnut. I haven't really watched much of his content. However, if you have a specific video you'd like me to react to on stream sometime, feel free to comment on the video directly, so that way I can get the notification and remember to add it to my list at some point. If you had something to do with her getting there, it could have been less in order and more suggesting things to push her that direction. Could you be a little bit more specific, Stella? Are you talking about Gideon and Nefeli specifically? And Henrik says he's probably a mix of all of these, yeah. So I do like the idea that he could just be trying to antagonize the player. That's very interesting and something I should probably consider a little bit more in depth as to how his motivations could work towards that goal. Okay, so you're talking about Gideon and Nefeli. If he had something to do with Nefeli getting there, it could have been less in order and more suggesting her to push in that direction. Yeah, I think if she kind of was there no matter what happened in her quest, unless she like, she died. I could see that a bit more, like if there was a failsafe, but as it stands right now, I'm a little bit more skeptical because Nefeli specifically offers to aid you, and she seems to become a strong, independent woman who don't need no stepfather, So, yeah, I just don't think it fully works out quite as well as I would like for the alternative. Albgade says, you don't know how strong this reading is, perhaps not just saying it's impossible, but that it's where he draws the line in relation to sin, that it would destroy the basic order of the world if humans could kill gods. Also, maybe it was already brought up, a description on the Lord's Divine... Yeah, Lord's Divine Fortification is brought up. It seems critical to understanding Gideon's worldview. So, there's the question of whether or not him saying man cannot kill a god is meant in a literal, like, they are unable to kill a god, versus man cannot kill a god as in a permissive sense. So, man is not allowed to kill God because of whatever reason, and that is kind of questionable as well. As far as the Japanese goes, it also uses man cannot kill a god in the terms of potentiality. It isn't necessarily like how do I say this in English? It doesn't use like the kind of grammar to suggest man should not kill a god, but that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be read in the kind of sense of potential. Like there is still like the ambiguity, although a little bit less so in the Japanese. All right, going back to the video now.
Found himself confronting something he didn't understand. Therefore, you could interpret Gideon's decision to intervene not as a calculated plan or with malicious intentions, but as a genuine fear of the world ending. Gideon's character is a paradoxical combination of endless knowledge in theory, but nothing more than a coward in practice. This is highlighted in his boss fight. He displays a repertoire of diverse spells, which will change depending on how many bosses and quests you have completed. I would recommend Garden of Eyes' video explaining this. It's an excellent detail program to reflect how Gideon's parasitical nature manifests in the world. For example, if you have killed Rykard before Gideon's fight, Gideon will now use Rykard's Rancor, a spell you only get access to after trading Rykard's Remembrance at the Round Table Hold. The same happens with Melania and Moog, but the opposite happens with Selen's quest. If you don't visit Master Azure, Gideon will learn Common Azure. This is amusing as it's the only requirement you don't have to fight a boss for, as it's the sorcerer literally handing over the spell. So Gideon, the opportunist and coward that he is, will claim this for himself if you don't.
That's interesting. I don't think I knew that aspect about Gideon. I knew he would get more spells and incantations if you killed the bosses, but the fact that he cannot loot Azure is fascinating and does lend more credence to the theory that he's kind of pillaging the remains of the bosses or like the areas after the Tarnished, rather than kind of being in his own parallel world competing with the Tarnished at the same time. So that's kind of a little bit of a bummer to me that he's being a bit more of an opportunist than kind of taking things for himself, which, is definitely part of his character, don't get me wrong, but it would have been nice to have like another more capable character in a FromSoft game that kind of ends up becoming your rival. So I know she said it earlier that like Gideon being there, maybe she didn't phrase it like as a surprise, but I was like, when I saw Gideon, I'm like, oh yep, I was expecting this from the beginning of the game, because that confrontation is pretty much made very clear when you more or less first talk to him. Need to know that partial difference of the Japanese word choice. Glad you liked that. It's a coding difference, yeah. Jay Bowden says, you feel like a super strong man becomes a god in all these games. The outer gods are different, clearly. Yeah, and we might get more about the outer gods, in the DLC, but I feel like everyone's huffing the copium and trying to believe that the DLC will answer everything. Albigade says the spells he get may also be related to order because you think you can only get 3 bonus spells, and if you face all 4 bosses, 1 gets overwritten. Oh, really? Interesting. And Azure might be the first one, so it could be overwritten as a coding difference. Well, I could probably test that fairly easily because I've got like a ton of save states on my computer. So maybe I'll need to remember to like look into that. Well, I don't. Yeah, I should be able to like, look into that a little bit more. Two Hit says he's a capable spy master. He has agents that do all the killing for him. He just gathers the intel from them all. Yeah, I don't necessarily think he had to challenge the bosses directly, although I think it would have been cooler because he certainly does have mastery over many spells and would be plausible that he could defeat them to some degree.
Despite having this library of spells that he stole, he is not a fighter. Based on his reluctance to engage directly with anyone, I doubt he's ever been in a fight, delegating possible combat encounters to his underlings, Ensha and Nephili.
So I think that might go a little bit too far, and I think in some ways you could tie the whole methodology or ideology that Gideon might have to something that you could find in the Art of War, where it tells you not to get into a fight unless you know you can win. I would imagine that would be very Gideon to not choose to fight unless he knew the odds were stacked in his favor. And so whether or not he, used Terra Magica and buffed himself to defeat all the bosses is one thing worth consideration. But I don't think he never got into a fight because he is a Tarnished. And yeah, I don't know, like maybe he did never like claimed great runes of his own, but then he just controlled the round table hold and just leveraged that ability or the goal ability of the Tarnished to give them access to the fingers, and he just kind of like followed along in our footsteps. That's a very possible reading as well, but it's just a little bit dissatisfying for me for no reason other than just the vibes, which isn't like the best thing, but it's just, the vibes, they matter, man. Gideon can't be inspired by Sun Tzu because he isn't constantly perpetually ranting about supply lines. Or is he?
Coping mechanism for his lack of combat skills and courage, but also most likely combined with a superiority complex as well. Like when you first met with him, he selectively wanted to only converse with those who had proved themselves. His complex extends to you, believing himself to be the most potent Tarnished and constantly underestimating your skill. Yet he critically lacks the self-awareness to realize that he is continually projecting his insecurities onto others.
He is a ruthless justiciar who commands a company of inquisitors, reviled for his serpentine demeanor. He's a grotesque old fool grasping for power. Despite knowing next to bloody nothing, he's so far up his own arse he won't suspect a thing. His inevitable display of arrogance will certainly be a sight to behold.
The revelation
Sounds like he got roasted by the Erdtree or burned by the Erdtree. Damn it, I screwed up my own joke. Hey Bella, welcome to the stream. You might have also missed like the setup for that punchline, which I apparently just threw out the window. He's a bully that copies our homework, if only. You wish we knew more about how Gideon interacts with others, because there's no one at Round Table Hold has a great rune before we got one. Yeah, it's very strange.
he experiences upon discovering Marika's intentions adds additional layers to the fears and concerns he has about becoming Elden Lord, so much so that he reaches a junction and chooses to withdraw, perceiving it impossible for any Tarnished to become a Lord, but not before deciding to actively stop anyone else from reaching his former goal. If Gideon can't, then no one can. It's spiteful, it's selfish, and it's so reminiscent of the dog in the manger metaphor. There was a dog lying in a manger who did not eat the grain, but who nevertheless prevented the horse from being able to eat anything either. Whether Gideon is a cunning manipulator or a frightened observer leaves so much room for interpretation, and you might have some thoughts that I didn't mention in this video, so please feel free to discuss anything in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on my return to Elden Ring. It's what I founded this channel on, and there will be more like this coming. I just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone who has been here and supported me. Anyone still here from when I first made my channel, I'd like to think that I've improved my video style, my video editing, especially my audio as well. I'm still tinkering around with it a bit, but thank you anyone who's been with me through this journey, and of course anyone new who stumbled across my channel. If you want to support me further, you can on my Patreon or YouTube members or Gamer Subs. Please use my code Chalice for 10% off. Big thank you everybody. Special thank you now to my channel members and patrons.
So yeah, that was a really good video. I enjoyed it quite a bit. Very level-headed and had some good observations. So as far as like the editing goes, if Miss Chalice watches this, I think it was done pretty well, to be honest. There was like only one part as far as the audio goes where I thought like the piano was ever so slightly loud, but every other part was, you know, perfectly fine. So yeah, good video. All right, so I've gone ahead and linked it in chat if you guys want to give Miss Chalice a like and or a sub. Oh yeah, I think this is actually my first video by her. That's interesting. A little glowingness. So Cav says, you do think there are a couple obvious parts of Gideon's characterization that you are still very curious about? Like, he's called Sir, that implies affiliation and service. With and to whom? Is he? I would need to like look at it. That could just be like a localization thing, but maybe not. She forgot the third potential interpretation of Gideon. He's really cool and correct about everything. He got her. It's incredibly silly that he wears the full plate armor. I mean, that's just all the better to protect himself with. Truly the big brain play right there. You assume he's an officer of America's military? I would doubt that just because he's like tarnished. But yeah, that was a good video by Miss Chalice. And next we'll be transitioning into a really long video for Honored Madman, at least, with Pieces of the Past, Dark Souls 3, where he seems to want to tie the games of Dark Souls 3 and Dark Souls 2 and talk about the references in both. So really interested in this one because a lot of people have some like very conflicted feelings about the ties between the games. So it's always nice for them to be made clearer for a wider audience. Does the Sir in English line up with the Japanese? I would need to know which text specifically you're talking about, just so I could like look it up quickly, because I don't remember off the top of my head where it appears. Sir Gideon Ofnir? I'll look that up quickly. Ugh. Where are we at? Oh, interesting. Just like in the title plate. Yeah, so there's no Sir here. So this is like all-knowing essentially, and then Gideon Ofnir. So this equal sign is just kind of like an interesting equivalent to almost like a space or like a slash at times. Anyway, so it's just Gideon Ofnir, the all-knowing. Sir Gideon. Signature weapon of Sir Gideon. Wait, is that the top? This is really weird. Okay. Oh, this is so small. Okay. You know, there's no Sir here. There's no suffix. There's no suffix either. So I think it's just part of the localization to give him a little bit of a flair. Yeah. Okay, same thing going on. Two Hit was watching this not too long ago and linked it in the Discord when the subject came up a few days ago. Yeah, I mean, this got probably linked a couple months ago. Probably when he first made it. I'm going to blame Mindspatch because she always links Honored Madman's videos, but I enjoy them, so it's all good. Straight up fabrication is definitely an interesting localization strategy. I mean, you'd be surprised, wouldn't you? Alright, so that was a good one by Miss Chalice. Now we'll move into Pieces of the Past by Honored Madman.
No flame, however brilliant, does not one day splutter and fade.
And now, our feature presentation.
Oh man, talk about nostalgia right there. Holy crap.
Alright, welcome back to Honored Madman. I hope everybody's doing well. One of the biggest criticisms of Dark Souls 3 is that it ignored most of the lore or themes from Dark Souls 2, and that's not entirely true. Sure, it takes way more cues and follows up on way more stuff from Dark Souls 1, but it doesn't necessarily mean 2 was ignored entirely. In fact, one of the bigger concepts in Dark Souls 3 seems to be an expansion of an idea that was introduced in Dark Souls 2, which had the first flame represented as the Throne of Want. Dark Souls 3 takes place way after the events of Dark Souls 2, after the cycles have passed many more times, and previous lords from ages long since past are now rising from their graves to help link the flame, only they're not. They ran off and did their own thing instead, and it's up to you, the player, to forcibly drag them back to their thrones and make them help you link the fire, since a lowly unkindled isn't hardly enough to light the fire on their own. Now, there isn't any real expansions on Dark Souls 2's main themes of hollowing out and forgetting who you are. Those seem to be left in the past, but there's still quite a few Dark Souls 2 references. Most of them are confined to a handful of different areas throughout the game. But let's start with the very first area that you'll start finding references to Dark Souls 2, the Firelink Shrine. And sure, Dark Souls 2 didn't even really have a shrine of its own. I mean, it had the Shrine of Amana, but that's a whole different story. Now, instead of a Firelink Shrine, it had Majula, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. But here at Dark Souls 3's famous hub world, you might happen to notice the giant tree just outside the door on the second floor of the Firelink Shrine. So in Dark Souls 2, the kingdom of Dranlake was invaded by a ferocious tribe of giants from the far north. These giants were attacking in retaliation for their own land having been pillaged by a king named Vendrick, who took something valuable of theirs and headed back to his own land, and used whatever he took to make the golems. So the giants turned much of Dranlake into a ruin, but were stopped by a nameless hero who defeated their king in single combat, who, yeah, turned out to be a time-traveling player character, real surprise there. And when most of these giants died, they sort of grew into the land where they fell. They turned into trees, if you were, for lack of a better term. And this tree is clearly one of these giants. I mean, he's got the whole gaping void in lieu of a face look. But that's not the only Dark Souls 2 reference here at the shrine. There's also a shrine.
Yeah, so that's a really good observation right there. That's one of my favorite bits of continuity between Dark Souls 2 and 3, especially with the Seed of the Tree of Giants description in Dark Souls 2, talking about those who leave the cycle of life and death, and I believe the giants turning trees is representative of one of those ways to leave the cycle, and another one being how humans and whatnot can meditate to become stony dragon boys who kind of lose their darkness and turn into nothingness. So, who just asked it? Cav asked, isn't the theme of hollowing out and losing yourself kind of elaborated across the entire setting in Dark Souls 3? Yes and no. I mean, if you just look at the base game, there isn't a lot of direct connection between Dark Souls 2 and 3 as far as the quest that the Unkindled goes. It's more like the Unkindled has been given a duty, whereas in Dark Souls 2, you're like, oh crap, man, turning undead sucks. How do I stop that? So Dark Souls 2 is a lot more of a personalized quest, and the issue is in 2, it talks about, well, at least in the Japanese, not so much the English, that the stronger you become in order to try to avert the curse, the more hardship you'll face, which will cause more suffering to come to you, and kind of coalesce into this issue where the more suffering you do, the stronger you get, the more you suffer. So all of a sudden, you're the biggest, baddest dude in the land. What do you do with it? You try to approach the source of the souls, essentially, which is kind of a reference to the first flame, and decide whether or not to link the flame or let things go, or try to find another path to be rid of the undead curse entirely, which doesn't exactly pan out for multiple reasons. So yeah, it's a pretty nuanced question, and Dark Souls 3 doesn't really look at that so much until the Ringed City with Lap, I think most specifically. And a little bit with what's her face? Cirrus and her grandfather, whose name I always freaking forget. Yeah, and as 2 Hit says, the tree also drops the seed the same way as DS2. Yes, thank you.
Shrine Handmaiden, who acts as your main merchant in the game, and she bears a striking resemblance to the old firekeepers that live in that hut and the things betwixt in Dark Souls 2. I mean, she's wearing the same outfit, she has the same sarcastic, kind of condescending attitude. She's wearing basically the same fit, and of course you can meet this lady in the Dark Firelink Shrine, which takes place in the past, I believe. And she seems to be, well, she's the only one there, but she seems to be aware of
Yeah, Dark Firelink is a real head scratcher because there's certainly aspects of it which seem evocative of the past, because if you go there first without talking to the Shrine Fire Maiden at all, and then come talk to her after the fact in the real shrine, well, in the hub shrine at least, she's like, which kind of implies a certain continuity between like the Underhill Lothric Untended Grays version of the Shrine Maiden and the current one, but also it doesn't fully seem to line up if it's the past, because the area there is completely dark and almost seems more representative of the future. But Ludleth also talks about how they betrayed the Firekeeper of that time, and so I don't know, it's something that I would like want to explore further on my own sometime, because I had some thoughts about it, because like I'm kind of a little bit wishy-washy, because in some ways it makes more sense to me that it would be representative of a potential future that could come to be but has not yet come to be. But then again, that also doesn't mesh super well with the continuity between these, Firekeepers and whatnot. Captini asks, does linking the flame annihilate the person doing it, or will he be left lingering like Gwyn or Soul of Cinder? Annihilation can be preferred state. So that's a good question, and I think it depends, because if you look at the previous Lords of Cinder like Ludleth or Yorm, despite them allegedly having linked the flame, that they still definitely exist to some degree. Maybe a little bit lesser in stature than they used to be, but it seems, at least in this point of the universe, the first flame doesn't completely annihilate beings when they link it, which might be why it does such a pitiful job when we try to link the flame, although there could be other reasons for that, like us being unkindled and being like the worst possible fuel for the first flame, because we are flameless ash. Yeah, Ludleth definitely seems to imply you're aware of it. When Ludleth is asleep, he talks about burning alive. Yeah. So the Lords of Cinder are very strange to me, because the implication should be that they all linked previously, which, Ludleth talks about like burning because he linked the flame and whatnot. But one of the questions I have is, how many times were the Lords of Cinder burned? Because we take their heat to, link the flame ourselves. So did the current 5 iterations of the Lords of Cinder forcefully take the heat from the other 4 at times? So let's say, for example, Ludleth was the most recent one to link. Did he take Yorm's fire? Did he also take Aldrich's fire and all that and whatnot? It's just a kind of awkward system, but at least in the previous cycles, the lords were more obedient and they served the thrones, and now they're like, no, we done did that. We're done with that. That stuff don't work no more. And so they don't. So yeah, Dark Souls 3, there's a lot of stuff that I do like about it, and then other things which I think could have used a little bit more time in the oven to play with our fiery metaphors here.
What's going on in the time travel shenanigans and whatnot, so she's definitely quite the knowledgeable character. Now, if you climb onto the roof of the Firelink Shrine and you happen to have in your possession a certain vertebra shackle, then you could trade it to these two birds up here for a very ornate and memorable mask. And that is, of course, Lucatiel's mask, the famous NPC from Dark Souls 2. She was definitely one of the most memorable ones, alongside people like Strayed and Vengarl, who unfortunately do not make appearances in Dark Souls 3, or are even mentioned, I might add. But
So I definitely screwed up like Lucatiel's quest here, because I talked to her and then I think I like skipped her dialogue. So there's one point in my game where I had her with her mask off, and then I like reloaded it because I was doing like some like lore stuff, I guess, and then I wasn't really paying attention to what she had to say because I think I already had the footage of it. And then I just like kept pressing X. And so she didn't actually finish her animation of taking her mask off. So she just had the mask on for the rest of the game. So I don't actually know if the mask stays off the entire time or if I just done goofed. Anyway, not very important, but I couldn't help but share.
arguably the best thing about Lucatiel's mask is its description. A Hollow once fought valiantly with this mask, but
okay, I guess that answers it, that it stays off. So nope, she was definitely masked for me. So rip.
feared the fading of herself and implored a comrade to remember her name. Perhaps that is why this gentleman's mask is named after a woman. So if you went through her questline in Dark Souls 2, you know that slowly but surely Lucatiel is losing herself, but you could stop her from losing herself, at least during the game, if she summoned for and survives at least 3 boss fights, which is pretty easy to do in Dark Souls 2. Now if you do this at the completion of her questline, she gives you her set and her sword and basically implores you to remember her name. And I think if nothing else, this little description proves that the main character of Dark Souls 2 did in fact complete Lucatiel's quest without her going hollow, at least during the game. And he carried this mask with him after parting ways with Lucatiel and basically sort of carried on her name in one way or another to the point where the mask just became known as Lucatiel's mask. Now that's not the only piece of Lucatiel. Her sword is in the game as well. You have to kill a curse-rotted Greatwood to, well, for lack of a better term, turn its soul into the Hollow Slayer Greatsword. The rest of her set is found in the Undead Settlement called the Mira set, in that big rickety house with the 2 evangelists. And this one's not even on my list, it's just now that I think about it, the idea of soul transposition in general is an idea that came from Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 1 had a much more long-winded way of getting boss soul weapons, and Dark Souls 2 basically had soul transposition, which was only through 2 characters, the legendary...
Yeah, I was going to say, you could potentially argue that it was in Dark Souls 1 as well, but Dark Souls 2 kind of expanded upon it a bit more.
Straight of Olafus and the Crow Demon, Weaponsmith Ornifex. I don't know if that says anything about Corland or anything, but I'm going to count it. Now, after you help out a certain hunchbacked pilgrim in the Firelink Shrine, a certain character might show up by the name of Yuria of Londor. Yuria happens to be in possession of a very unique katana called the Dark Drift with a sort of invisible ghostly blade, and this sword was last seen in the possession of Grave Warden Agdane back in Dark Souls 2, who guarded the undead crypt, where Vendrick and numerous other hollows rested. Now it's tough to say how Yuria got her hands on this weapon, but he did kind of just give it to the main character of Dark Souls 2 after they took care of Vendrick. So maybe somewhere down the line, the bearer of the curse from Dark Souls 2 just traded it or lost it, or died and it was looted from his grave, who knows? Or maybe those witches and pyromancers in the undead crypt finally staged an uprising against the Finito and Grave Wardens. Heavy speculation, I know, but I mean, let's look at the Grave Warden's function now. I mean, they're no longer trying to keep the undead resting, they're taking them down, killing them, making them rest. But anyway, while we're on this...
Yeah, and maybe I should like double check whether or not the Grave Wardens use the same kanji, but I think even if they did, it doesn't really matter because their functions are very different in the games. And of course, the Cathedral of the Deep, well, maybe I shouldn't say of course. Maybe the Cathedral of the Deep isn't supposed to be like the undead crypt and whatnot. I mean, I would assume not, but who really knows with the whole time is convoluted and the lands converging nonsense. A Cursed Wood gets a DS2 Cursed Hollows weapon. Yeah. Jay Bowden says, in their headcanon, it takes more time than instantly to come back from death in these games, maybe even years. I don't know about years, but there's certainly a certain amount of time because, at least with the Grave Warden set here specifically, they talk about wanting to bleed the undead not alive, but they want to bleed the undead because it slows reanimation. So it seems like when something dies, it might take a little bit of time to come back. Maybe some like comparably to a zombie in a normal film, a normal zombie film, not just any film with all their zombies, but yeah, a zombie film specifically.
Subject of Yuria, I can't be the only one who thinks that her mask looks sort of like a combination of the Sealer mask from Dark Souls 1 and, more importantly, the Shadow mask from Dark Souls 2. You know, it's beaked, it looks vaguely similar, and we know a little bit of lore about these shadows, or Shadow Men as they're called in Dark Souls 2. They originally came from an order of assassin-themed warriors out of Mira. Now, the group seemingly had a somewhat high turnover rate, and it's generally believed that all those who fled even the feared Shadow Knights of Mira must be ones who have forsaken their honor on a cellular level, and were presumably forced to eventually resort to unseemly mercenary work. You know, no job was too dirty for these suspicious shadows, and suffice it to say, it was never really that hard for them to find work. In this case, where they served as either bagmen for King Vendrick or the King of Olafis, they were hired to cull the hollow population, only to eventually hollow out themselves. And what's Londor? Well, it is the land of hollows, so I think it's safe to assume that these shadow men were absorbed into the Sable Church of Londor.
I think that is a little bit risky, but oh well, I don't know.
Again, with the heavy speculation this early in the video, but it definitely seems like a possibility. I can't really place any other connections besides it just looks like it, and I wanted to mention it. Now moving on to the next location, one of my favorites in the game and another area rife with references to Dark Souls 2, the Cathedral of the Deep. So there's something I just really like about this place. Maybe it's the architecture, maybe it's just the eerie feeling it has, the atmosphere, or maybe it's just the Dark Souls 2 references. I don't know, it just works for me. But this chapel, before being
Same. Cathedral of the Deep might be my favorite area and might have one of the worst bosses. It feels bad, man.
Devoted to an eldritch cult of the dreams of a sentient cannibalistic blob, it was a Way of White chapel, and it was dedicated to the goddess Catha. Now, Catha is an interesting choice of a god because she was not in Dark Souls 1.
And because I noticed it earlier today because we were in Langdell, yeah, this little relief sculpture shows up in a lot of places in Elden Ring, and it's just reused from the Cathedral of the Deep in Dark Souls 3.
In fact, she sort of seems to have replaced a certain goddess in Dark Souls 1 by the name of Fina, a big figure in the Way of White and the Land of Morn. Now, this goddess was first introduced in Dark Souls 2, and then fast forward to Dark Souls 3, and pretty much every mention of Morn or the Way of White.
Did he say she replaced Fina? I'm trying to remember if that was actually the same, because I think I need to look at the ring specifically, but I don't know.
Goddess in Dark Souls 1
seems to have replaced a certain goddess in DS1
by the name of Fina, a big figure in the Way of White and
Let me double check.
Land of Morn. Now, this goddess was first introduced in Dark Souls 2, and then fast forward to Dark Souls 3, and pretty much every mention of Morn or the Way of White also has some mention of Catha. She is described as being the goddess of tears, and understandably every Tearstone ring now references her. She's generally known to be a compassionate figure that carries us through times of tragedy. But curiously, her chime is incapable of casting miracles.
Yeah, so I don't know about the Fina connection specifically. I feel like I should remember, but I'm drawing a blank. And at the very least, it isn't on the Tearstone rings in Dark Souls 1, which would be, the best indicator of the original goddess of that would have predated Kaita at least.
It's probably for that reason that it was said to be rare even amongst Karim clerics. And I think that makes sense. The dark can only be used and controlled and understood by those who have experienced great tragedy or utter darkness, at least as we learn in Dark Souls 2 through guys like Falcon and Wheels. And the chime does indeed appear in both
Wheel.
Dark Souls 2 and 3. There's just a lot less dark-based miracles to use in Dark Souls 3, so its function as the hex-based catalyst is sort of a lot less than it was in Dark Souls 2. Anyway, though, I'm sure its association with hexes are what led to the rumors that Keitha wasn't a goddess at all, and that she was actually a demoness who led people into misfortune, and presumably fed off of their despair. To me, though, that just sounds like propaganda perpetuated by overzealous fundamentalists who still are clinging to the old ways of believing in Fina. I mean, we know...
Yeah, I mean, I agree with pretty much all of that except for the part about Fina, but that might just be because I don't fully remember the Fina-Keitha connection. So, yeah, I think, and if you were in a war with anybody and all of a sudden they started being magically healed by some witch, essentially, there would probably be a decent amount of slander against them for cheating. But yeah, so I could definitely see Keitha's powers as demonic to her enemies, because they don't want that. She's cheating.
Oh, what kind of shit her followers can get up to. Now, there's a lot of different theories about Keitha, so I'll save those for a different video and just leave that one at that. Another big thing in the Cathedral of the Deep, although it isn't exclusive to this area, is the Grave Wardens. Now, these guys were first mentioned or brought up in Dark Souls 2, although they looked very different. Their job in that game was to maintain the undead's sleep, a job given to them by the first of the dead, Nito, who created the Finito, like these blue undead type beings, to be and lead the Grave Wardens to basically just keep the crypt in order and keep all the dead sleeping. Similar to what the Milfinito do and sing for the undead down in the Shrine of Amana, the undead Grave Wardens in this game appear to have adopted a new job. Instead of watching over the dead and ensuring that they maintain a peaceful sleep, these new Grave Wardens forcibly put down all of the undead that continuously rise in the graveyards surrounding the Cathedral of the Deep, and places like the untended graves or just the graveyard outside the Firelink Shrine, which is
It's a whole I'll give you something to sleep about scenario right here. So yeah, I did just look up the kanji for the characters since they were brought up a bit more directly here, and they are the same. So whether or not they're meant to be literally the same or just figuratively is open for interpretation still.
is the same place. Now, if you happen to take a walk through the sludge and gore fields in the Grand Hall of the Grand Cathedral, where the two really big giant slaves are, you might stumble across the remains of a Drang Knight and his armor and weapons. This set was referred to as the Llewellyn set back in Dark Souls 2, and only a few of them were said to have been created. Presumably they went to the highest ranking knights of Vendrick and Dranlaek. Extremely lightweight and very Game of Thrones looking, these were arguably one of the cooler sets in Dark Souls 2, a game that in my opinion has the best armor across all of the Soulsborne genre. Now, it's interesting to note that you find the armor in pieces and the weapons kind of separate from it, so it's maybe safe to assume that these guys, or at least one of these guys, these Drang Knights, hated giants enough to take a crack at one of the giant slaves guarding the cathedral. And we see how that turned out for him. He either got stomped into a million pieces or he got eaten and shit out. Both not so glamorous fates for these remnants of a forgotten land. Speaking of forgotten lands, if you remember the witch tree.
And there's also the two I guess they're not really invaders, the two NPCs that guard the not Cathedral of the Deep, the Anne Orlando area, behind Sullivan and before Aldrich, before the Silver Knights and whatnot. Those two dudes are wearing Drang sets, if I'm remembering correctly. Appropriate that the Drangleic Knights are power stancing. Are they? Yeah, I guess they kind of are.
Belvine back in Dark Souls 2 is now referred to as the Saint Tree Belvine, which is really interesting, especially considering the branch isn't renamed to Saint Tree Branch. But the Belvine is also found here at a church, which isn't really that surprising, especially with these new deacons who live here. These guys are probably the reason it's renamed, since the miracles and pyromancies that they tend to use draw from intelligence and faith, and that was the whole major selling point for the Belvine. It makes sense that it wouldn't be referred to as a Witch Tree Belvine anymore because they're not heretics. So the last little reference I could find to Dark Souls 2 within the Cathedral of the Deep has to do with one of my favorite bosses in the series, the Pursuer, Soulsborne's own Terminator. Just a cool boss with a really sick design whose armor we actually don't get in the game, which kinda sucks. And I do kinda wish he kept pursuing us after the Bastille, but he
I think you can get the shield. I'm pretty confident.
only really shows up in the Things Betwixt after that. Anyway, though, this reference to the legendary Pursuer comes in the form of his shield, even if it is held a different way now.
He's literally
Curse
talking about the
Ward
armor
Great
set.
Shield. It's said that this shield was given to those who attempted to resist the curse long ago. It's considered ungodly heavy, which has led some to believe that its heaviness was meant to be a representation of the foolishness of resisting the curse. Now that being said, those who are capable of using this have not found its protection against the curse wanting. So it's really saying, like, you know, it's extremely hard to resist the curse, but it is doable if you could bear the weight. You can, you know, here's a boon, here's something to make it a little bit easier. And the weak would, of course, just see it for representing the foolishness of even attempting to resist it. And that's just something I love about Dark Souls lore in general. There's always that little bit of nuance to it, these two different perspectives or more, and, you know, there's validity in both of them. Anyway, I'm getting a little...
And then one of the more interesting aspects of the Pursuers to me is that the Japanese name is Jubaksha, which means, like, curse-bound one, or it could potentially be interpreted as curse binder. So I think it's meant to work on both levels simultaneously, in that the Pursuers themselves are bound by a curse to hunt the undead, and they're bound to hunt the cursed undead. So I think it's a double entendre, essentially. So Jay Bowden asks, why are giants and other non-men hollow? That's a good question. I can't exactly speak for every little thing, because I think, like, the dogs are technically hollow, which is really awkward. I'll need to think about that one a bit more, to be honest. That's a good question. Sorry, I don't have a better answer right now.
A little bit off topic, let's move on to the next location. This one is sort of a double. It's the Smoldering Lake and the Catacombs of Carthus combined. It just made sense to combine them since they appear to be a part of each other. Now this one has got quite a lot of DS2 references. Now let's start with probably one of the more famous ones, the Shield of Want. None other than Vendrick's shield itself. And you could only get this shield by basically transposing his soul into it back in Dark Souls 2. So if you ever need more proof that Vendrick existed and that Dark Souls 2 is canon, I mean, there it is. I mean, there's also several other examples you could use, but that's a big one. Personally, I like to think that the remains of the Shrine of Amano wound up down here mainly because not only do we find Vendrick's shield, we also find one of the great bows of one of his elite personal guards, the Dragon Riders. Now sure, that doesn't necessarily prove anything, and I'm not, you know, saying it does. If I had to just theorize based on the look of things and the items and the descriptions found in the area, I'd say it's at least somewhat possible for this location to be a combination of the locations from previous games due to the converging nature of the world in Dark Souls 3. In this case, I'd have to say the locations would be the Shrine of Amana, and more obviously the Ash Lake from Dark Souls 1, as well as the demon cities of Lost Izalith. I mean, that one's a little bit more blatant as well. But let's move on to another one of my favorite Dark Souls 2 references in Dark Souls 3. And now this guy also has a Dark Souls 1 reference too, but we're not talking about that today. I'm of course referring to Night Slayer Sorig. Now Sorig, he's sort of a brutal guy. He's basically like the dark version of Black Iron Tarkus from Dark Souls 1. While Tarkus was a helpful JoJo's reference that was more than happy to help anyone worthy pass through Sen's Fortress's final challenge, the Iron Golem, Sorig was all about killing famous knights and invading people. He was basically like the troll version of Tarkus, the cooler younger brother, if you will. And man, let's just say this...
I appreciate the little fireball when he's just trying to get his own footage.
Guy did not fuck around at all. First, he presumably scaled and then descended Broom Tower and found the Foom Sword of Rebel the Rame, whose name was now forgotten. And from there, with his new sword, Sorg headed off to Ilium Lois, where he engaged in a brutal confrontation against its defenders, eventually winning this conflict and returning home with their rings still attached to their frozen severed fingers. It's almost like Sorig wears Tarkus's armor to fool people into thinking that he's going to be helpful and friendly. Now, another more obscure reference found down in the catacombs of Karthus is the Black Blade Katana, which used to be referred to as the Berserker Blade, the personal weapon of the Mad Warrior and the tribe of Prowlers that presumably hailed from the east, but Vendrick invited at least one into his court, who, among the many charlatans and tricksters and scammers that Vendrick had invited, this Mad Warrior was actually the real deal, and he looked like the Predator. Now, the fact that one of these bad boys is found in Karthus leads me to believe that Wolnir also invited one of these Mad Warriors into his fold, presumably at the height of his power, and, unrelated to the Mad Warrior, but just like Vendrick, Wolnir's kingdom began to descend into the darkness. And speaking of, High Lord Wolnir,
yeah, I definitely didn't know the sword connection. Also, because I didn't really play DS2 until after playing DS3, so I definitely would have missed those things.
Shares some parallels with the main character of Dark Souls 2 as well. I mean, this guy was a conqueror who showed up in Karthus, a famous desert land.
I don't remember that cutscene.
This guy was
Is this interesting? Yeah, I should double check this because this looks like the not Mira. Is it what's it called? The Millwood type thing? And I think that might relate to Jugo of not Benhart. Maybe no. Maybe Benhart did have something like this on him, but I don't remember what his set is called. Yeah, I'm really bad at the visual imagery of Dark Souls 2 because I played through the game once and never again. So I appreciate these connections. Not that he pointed this one out. I'm just thinking.
Conqueror who showed up in Karthus, a famous desert land full of swordsmen, which very well could be Jugo from Dark Souls 2. And Karthus during this day was ruled over by several lesser lords who all wore crowns. Then one day Wolnir showed up, killed all the lords, and ground their crowns into dust and had a new crown made from, the dust. It's sort of reminiscent of what the main character of Dark Souls 2 does with the crowns of the DLC kings. See, at the end of every DLC in Dark Souls 2, you're presented with a crown of the respective king of the kingdom whose DLC you completed. And once you have all the crowns, you can, in a sense, ground them down and create a new crown. A very powerful one at that, one that actually keeps you from hollowing. It was Vendrick's attempted salve on the curse of the undead, if you will. And I'm not saying Wolnir's crown did anything similar. I mean, clearly he's undead in some way. It's just interesting how he did something quite similar to the bearer of the curse. Now, the last piece of Dark Souls 2...
Yeah, and I kind of have been meaning to make this video for a very, very long time. It's been on my back burner, and I kind of... anyway. So, a lot of Wolnir's lore got really messed up due to localization, and Wolnir is actually supposed to be one of the biggest badasses in all Dark Souls lore history, which gets kind of undone a lot by how lackluster his fight ends up being. But anyway, as Honored Madman just talked about taking all of these crowns and grinding them to dust, there's something else that goes along with that, in that Wolnir wanted to call himself the last of the dead. So he wanted to be the Omega version of Nito, if you consider Nito the Alpha, Alpha Omega style imagery. So Jay Bowden, thank you so much for the 1999. Okay, it's kind of hard to see with the image. Appreciate that very much. Gonna send me a dono. The messenger attached to super chats is not working. Love the live streams. A lifesaver working nights. Thank you for the dono. I appreciate that. Yeah. And so I really do need to make that Wolnir video, because there's some other really cool stuff relating to the pyromancies that he's got going on that I think is definitely worth sharing. So I do appreciate Honored Madman making the crown connection as well. So I'm just a little bit salty that it doesn't go quite as far as it needs to. Not Honored Madman, but just the localization.
reference down here in the catacomb/smoldering lake is something you have access to only after you've slain the old demon king down in the smoldering lake and decidedly transposed his soul into a little pyromancy called Chaos Bed Vestiges. Now, back in Dark Souls 2, where this pyromancy was introduced, it was known as Forbidden Sun, and it was described as a devastating pyromancy that had been developed in Aldia, where the madman who created it never really questioned the need for this level of devastating and unstoppable power. It's safe.
I like the little stank that he threw on in Aldia. And also, it's really funny to me that like the description for that is like, did they ever even stop to think about why the hell they would need a spell like this? It's just kind of funny to me. Obviously, it's not written that way verbatim, but yeah. As you may have guessed, a little bit of a localization kerfluffle where they say in Aldia rather than by Aldia, and that's something that's not too uncommon for like translating Japanese without context. Although I think it is pretty bad in Dark Souls 2 that it talks about in Aldia in like one part of a paragraph, and then the second paragraph talks about Lord Aldia. So it should have been pretty clear, I think, from the context that Aldia was a reference to a person and not a place. Although I guess it could have seemed to have been both to the localizers at some point. And I do think there might have been some other like timing issues because obviously the DLC hadn't been released first. I know they did revise some item descriptions at some point, but yeah, I don't know the full story. Like DS2 has its own host of issues as far as like development goes. So it doesn't surprise me that localization would have also been one of them. Whoa. It's broken. I'm gonna
The need for this level of devastating and unstoppable power. It's safe to assume that this pyromancy was probably created by royal court sorcerer Navlon, or at least whatever entity is currently possessing him. And there is a notable difference in the Forbidden Sun pyromancy versus the Chaos Bed Vestiges one. They may share the same icon, but the spells aren't exactly identical. See, the Forbidden Sun has an added bonus of blanketing the targeted area with magma after the explosion, in a manner similar to the other pyromancy Great Chaos Fireball or Great Chaos Fire Orb, showing that the madmen of Aldia have in fact improved upon a pyromancy that was once created by the very founders of pyromancy themselves. And we learn from Dark Souls 3's description that the spell is derived from little pieces of the infernal seedbed, once known as the Bed of Chaos that birthed the demons. These are like little pieces of it that have been weaponized. And it's safe to say that Aldia, or the madmen under his control...
And one of my favorite bits of lore was that, like, to the demons, those little scraps were life itself, which is really cool. And just ties into a lot of that stuff relating to chaos, just kind of consuming whatever, because that seems to be one of the core themes of just like life in general in these games, like having an all-consuming hunger or thirst to some degree, with like men to a certain extent rising above that due to their rationality, and then once they lose that rationality due to hollowing, they regain that unquenchable or insatiable hunger, I should say. Oh boy. Having the issues. And the annoying thing is, like, on the playback bar, it seems like it's buffered a little bit. So it's always very annoying when stuff like this happens to me. Ooh, YouTube is having some issues, huh?
Develop their pyromancy in a similar way. I imagine they just found a couple pieces of the Bed of Chaos and researched them. I mean, you've seen Aldia's Keep. If there's one thing that guy and his people are passionate about, it's scientific pursuits. Now, moving on to the next chronological location where we're going to find a lot of Dark Souls 2 references. And you guessed it, Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. So I guess first off, there is the paintings in the Distant Manor that I did a whole video about. So no less than 3 of the 6 paintings in this room represent things or people from Dark Souls 2. And the first and probably the most noticeable is the portrait of Nishandra, one of the more sinister shards of Manus and the main antagonist of Dark Souls 2. In fact,
Yeah, I am a little bit disappointed that that portrait doesn't curse the player either. Oh, obviously, maybe that's a little bit much, but I don't know. Maybe it shows just how gone Nishandra really is by this point in the chronology.
In fact, I think it's possible that this may be a piece of the very same portrait of Nishandra that we see in Dranlake Castle in Dark Souls 2. Now, in that game, the portrait actually cursed you when you got close to it, and I suppose that was there to foreshadow Nishandra's dark nature. And it's interesting that King Vendrick, the guy that was seduced by Nishandra and found out all too late, and was then forced to scramble in an effort to lock Nishandra out of the Throne of Want, preventing her from achieving her goals through an admittedly over-elaborate means. He's only remembered as an old king of want, or an old king that beckoned the dark and, got more than he was bargaining for. And most of the descriptions don't exactly cast him in a very positive light. It appears as though Nishandra managed to somehow escape blame for what happened to Dranlake, as it seems to have all fallen on Vendrick. Which is why, to me at least, her portrait in Irithyll indicates that she's remembered rather fondly, and not as a ruthless schemer whose plots basically brought Dranlake to ruin. As to how the portrait wound up...
Honestly, it's kind of funny to look at it that way, just because I always just looked at it as an Easter egg and nothing more, not actually having like lore significance. Although maybe at some point in development it did have more significance with like Sullivan or something like that. Because, oh man, YouTube's being weird. Because I know a lot of that stuff really got shifted around in development, so it might have had more import at one point, and I just never really thought about it too much, to be honest. So it's kind of nice thinking about it from this perspective right now. I'm just going to refresh the page if it's doing this every time. 2157.
Very positive light. It appears as though Nishandra managed to somehow escape blame for what happened to Dranlake, as it seems to have all fallen on Vendrick. Which is why, to me at least, her portrait in Irithyll indicates that she's remembered rather fondly, and not as a ruthless schemer whose plots basically brought Dranlake to ruin. As to how the portrait wound up in Irithyll, it's really tough to say, but there do happen to be some Dranlake refugees located in the very same city, so maybe there's some connection there. The other one is the old Iron King's throne from the DLC, The Crown of the Iron King. I'd have to say the significance of that one is because the old Iron King was said to be Gwyn's reincarnation. Therefore, I guess it's not all that surprising that they would have this painting, although who knows if anyone even knows that. The last Dark Souls picture is, of course, Frozen Ilium Lois, one of the, in my opinion at least, more beautiful locations in the Dark Souls 2 DLCs. Now, the significance of this one is sort of in question. I mean, it's possible that it was located in the Boreal Valley before it was called the Boreal Valley, and that maybe Irithyll was built over it, but then again, where's Anor Londo? You don't see Anor Londo above Frozen Ilium Lois.
So I wonder if the kind of significance it's supposed to have is to that of the Profaned Flame, because there's supposed to be like the old chaos here, and I've wondered whether or not the idea behind the Profaned Flame is what you would get once the chaos settles down and becomes more orderly. Although the Profaned Flame is something that I often refer to as kind of like being its own lore black hole, or just like kind of there, and something that I wish that they really expanded upon more. Jay Bowden says, you think in Dark Souls games, giants and men are the same species with different souls? It's like the Hindu caste system where they can interbreed, but it'd be frowned upon. I don't know about that part, but at the very least, I've wondered that as well. And there is a certain, what's the word that they actually use for it in the description? A kinship between the giants and humans. Because when you look at the giants' souls specifically, they seem to have like a little bit of darkness within them, at least on their icons, which is obviously comparable to how humans have the darkness of the humanity sprites, presumably within them as well. And so if they're similar, it's unclear how different. Oh man, I'm really phrasing this terribly. If the two have some kind of kinship, then how much kinship they actually share between them is a little bit unexplored, and it could just be, um, a race specific thing that there's just still some kind of greater incompatibilities between them. But that aside, there is still the kind of weird fraternization and friendship that humans have had with giants at times, with the chosen undead and their friendship with Hawkeye Guff in Dark Souls 1, or the masked giant in Dark Souls 3. So whether or not that's like supposed to be more significant is unclear, but certainly the gods treat men and giants as much lesser beings. So they, at the very least, have that in common. Algate says, Lore Black Hole is an excellent term for profane flame. DS3 has a few LOL, unfortunately, but so do all of them, just more notable since 3 is conclusive. Yeah, that's kind of how I feel as well. Obviously, there's more that I wish we knew about Dark Souls 1 and 2, but while Dark Souls 3 does give some final answers to the questions of DS1 and 2, I think there's also just as many new mechanics that go woefully unexplained. So, rip.
So maybe it's there to show that that's the origins of the profane flame, as I've said in previous videos.
Man, I've just been on a roll tonight, stepping all over these videos' toes in the lore theorization category. I feel bad now.
I like to think that the old chaos that's buried deep beneath Frozen Ilium Lois actually became the profane flame over...
Man, now I feel really bad instead of like stealing his thunder. It almost feels like I watched this video already. Oh, lost subtitles. Okay.
A long course of time, I'd imagine, and maybe some careless descendants of Alsanas. But we'll get into that when we get to the profane capital chapter. Anyways, though...
Right, and so that whole Alsana thing, the Silent Oracle, does use a different set of kanji than the oracles referenced in Irithyll. Not Irithyll, no, yeah, Irithyll? I think so. Anyway.
Pontiff Sullivan has a few Drang Knights stationed here in the city, just outside the way to Anne Orlando, in fact. And these mercenary Drang Knights have apparently, at least from the looks of it, really whooped the shit out of the giant slave population here in Irithyll. In previous videos, I've said it looked like they just put down a little giant uprising, and I do kind of think that. But there's not really much that backs that up. It's just a fun headcanon type of situation. Since, the Drang Knights probably hate giants. I mean, their homeland was destroyed by a ferocious giant horde that said...
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting point. Although, I wonder how much of that animosity remained ever since, like, the ages ended. And it is also kind of strange that there's even, like, Drang Knights at all anymore, but they became, like, a band of mercenaries. So I do wonder how many of their ties to their homeland is like present. Well, relatively speaking, obviously.
Sailed over on giant longboats like the Vikings. I mean, it makes sense that the descendants of Dranlake would hate giants and would want to kill them wherever they saw them, even if they weren't the exact same giants that destroyed their homeland. These guys had probably heard stories all their lives about how brutal and evil the giants were, and now here they are in the flesh. So these Drang Knights were descended from the surviving nobility of the ruined Dranlaic. They became known as brutal mercenaries with their trademarked weapon in each hand fighting style, a reference to the power stancing gameplay mechanic that was introduced in Dark Souls 2. Anytime a Drang Knight is found, a set of paired weapons isn't far. I would even go so far as to say that the sellsword starting class is also from Drang, he just maybe lost his Llewellyn set. Or maybe his ancestor got his all ruined and destroyed, who knows. But as we know, back in Dark Souls 2, this Drang set, or the Llewellyn set as it was then known, was worn only by Chancellor Veliger, the ghost of Dranlaic Castle, who eventually gives you the set after a certain amount of progression in the main story, along with the Royal Dirk and I believe the Llewellyn Shield, which is also found in Dark Souls 3, in the possession of a certain hollow named Horus the Hushed. It is worth noting, though, that after the events of Dark Souls 2, Dranlek became known as a land known for linking the fire.
Alright, so Horus is the quiet guy, so I am right for thinking that Sirius's grandfather is Hodrick, but in my mind I'm like, no, Hodrick is Henri's compatriot. I'm so bad at remembering those two dudes specifically. Anyway, not important.
First, I didn't really know what that meant, but look at what linking the fire means in Dark Souls 3. It means taking a throne. Something that was, introduced in Dark Souls 2. So it makes sense that Dranlek would eventually become famous as this place that once is known for linking the flame. They were probably the first to link it in its new form as a throne, when previously it had just been done how it was done back in Dark Souls 1 at the Kiln. Gwyn did it, the Chosen Undead in that game did it, and Solaire all did it. Dark Souls 2 takes place ages later, like thousands of years later, so it makes sense that things would be somewhat different, and that's why all of the Lords of Cinder have thrones that they have to be forcibly returned to. But even with all that being said, I do think a better legacy for Dranlek would be a land that was known for its war with the giants, because, that's one of the defining traits of Dranlek. Its constant struggles with the big guys. Anyway, though, I'm getting a little sidetracked. Now, it's not every day that a character from Dark Souls 2 shows up in the flesh in Dark Souls 3, but when they do, they're usually an invader. And in this case, we've got the famous serial killer Cretan the Wanderer from Dark Souls 2, the arch rival of Pate, the
Anybody else catch the audio of the lighter going and then the audio cut? I'm gonna back that up.
They're usually an invader. And in this case, we've got the famous serial killer Cretan the Wanderer from Dark Souls 2, the arch rival of Pate, the supposed Patches reincarnation. Now, he is intimately tied to Cirrus of the Sunless Realms' quest, and the only way to get his set is to be summoned into her world and help her defeat him. Afterwards, he'll invade you on his own and get bested, but Cretan survived all this time and wound up becoming a finger of Rosaria. He could have been reborn countless times and could very well be on his way to becoming a man-grub. Another side note I'd like to say is I believe at least, that the Sunless Realm is what became of Mira. Now, Irithyll is also where the Witch Tree branch is.
I'm trying to remember. That sounds like it's right, but it's been a long time since I double-checked everything relating to the Sunless Realm and whatnot. Because I think the Sunless Realm shield is like the target shield or something like that. So I think Honored Madman is right, but I would need to double check everything myself. Albigade says, you think it's suggested that Dranlek wasn't even the first kingdom in that region that linked the fire, like Olafus and many others? Yeah, for sure. Sunless Realm gear is protective against magic and dark. I know, there's a certain continuity between the Sunless Realms and or the Dark Moon to an extent, but I just don't remember if there was a connection to Mira directly as well. It sounds right, but I would need to do some more research.
Is found the spellcasting counterpart to the Bellvine. Now, next up has, in my opinion, quite possibly the most Dark Souls 2 references out of any location in the game, and it's what I've been waiting all this video so far to talk about. That's right, we're going to be talking about the Profaned Capital. Now, I do truly believe this place to be whatever country came after Dranlek, whatever country emerged from the rubble that was Dranlek, I like to imagine eventually became the Profaned Capital and was then buried underneath the ground once again. But let's start with these references. Now, the first of these, in my opinion, would be the...
Alright, so I did look up the shields. There might be another shield, but anyway. Here is Zoink Scoob. The Sunset Shield and its icon. And compare it to the target shield of Dark Souls 2, DS3, DS2, they're a little bit different. I think there might be another shield that it could be based off of, but those are the two that stand out to me. And the target shield, I should go back to it, says nothing about its origin. So anyway, there might be another way to connect it to Mira. Maybe Lucatiel uses it? I don't remember. And that's also like one part of the lore that I'm like really weak at, remembering what NPCs use wet weapons and whatnot. They seem heavily associated with Gwendolyn, but it could just be them having similar themes. Well, I know Sirius was a Dark Moon Knight, so there's that. But okay, where am I at?
The giant crack in the profane capital's background that to me resembles the crack that leads to Majula in the Things Betwixt back in Dark Souls 2. Sure, they're not exactly one in one the same exact shaped crack, but things can change over time. And if nothing,
I like that idea. I mean, I don't fully buy it either, but it's neat.
else, it's clearly trying to evoke the same imagery of the crack in the Things Betwixt, at the very least. But that one's just the first of many down here in the profane capital. The next and probably most obvious is Laddersmith Gilligan. Now, as we talked about a little bit ago, Patches didn't appear in Dark Souls 2. He was, absent, even though there is concept art of him wearing some really cool looking armor that you can still get in the game. Patches himself made no such appearance. Instead, many view that his role is filled by the character of Pate. And sure, they do share some similarities, I guess, but the main difference is that Pate seems to actually warn you of danger, whereas usually Patches does no such thing. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. My main reason for bringing up Pate is that if anybody is Patches' incarnation in Dark Souls 2, I don't think it's him, I think it's Laddersmith Gilligan. First of all, they have some of the same quotes. They both say cheers for that. They're both pretty condescending. That's charge funny. Exorbitant prices for goods that aren't worth it. Only problem is Gilligan doesn't really have any of Patches' charm. His main function is, as a laddersmith, to sell you ladders. And yeah, as I already said, they aren't cheap either, and the main use for them is to just get down to the bottom of the pit in Majula to access Black Gulch. Something that can be done also with the Silver Cat ring and a decent amount of health. But anyway, it looks like Gilligan finally met his end just as Blacksmith Leningrass predicted, and not at the hands of Royal Court Sorcerer Navlon, at least I don't think. It almost looks like he fell from an extremely high height. Maybe Patches pushed him off a cliff for copying his style and stealing his black leather set. But honestly, who knows? His corpse is right there by the bonfire in the profane capital in that tower. But yeah, it's unclear how he died, but I like to imagine it had something to do with fall damage. Now next up, we're going to talk a little bit about the famous Lord of Cinder, Yorm the Giant, who I covered somewhat extensively in my Giants video recently. You should check that out if you haven't already. It's definitely one of my better vids. Anyway, though, we're told that Yorm the Giant is the descendant of an ancient conqueror, and that he was asked by the very same people that his ancestor once subjugated to lead them. And he became a valiant protector of his people and his kingdom, and really never once faltered even when he lost his loved one.
I wonder if we're going to end up having the same headcanon here.
Chose to cast aside his great shield and add a notch to his machete so he could use it with two hands. And though he was this noble and brutal protector of the profane capital's people, the humans still viewed him with distrust. So Yorm gave them a giant killing sword and told them that if they could do a better job, they could come take the throne from him if they wanted. But unsurprisingly, no one really ever succeeded. Anyway, though, the story of his giant ancestor conqueror sounds a lot like the Giant Lord from Dark Souls 2, who Yorm bears a striking resemblance to. Now, we've mentioned in the past how Yorm isn't necessarily one of the Dark Souls 2 giants because he does in fact have a face, eyes, and a mouth and a chin. He could be a half-human, half-giant hybrid. I know some have argued that he's just a very large hollow and not a true giant at all. I don't really think that's the case, but maybe there's some translation that'll prove me wrong. It all seems
I don't recall anything like that, and I think the more common idea about Yorm and or his lineage would be that he's kind of like an adjudicator giant. So anyway, I have kind of been of the opinion that he might be related to Rame or Rhyme, I think, from like Ilium Lois, because he's got this interesting falcon on either his armor set or something like that that was shared in common with Rame. Let me look it up real quick. If I find it quickly, that'll be fine, and if I don't... Okay, the Rebel's Great Shield from Dark Souls 2. Fudge, why is this getting stuck? It says, Shield of the Rebel, Rame and Velstadt were known as the left and right arms of the king until their wills clashed and Rame was deemed a traitor. The Black Raven is despised as an augur of death, but it was Rame's favorite bird. So, let's type in Yormhawk. Maybe I should do this over here just to be safe. Is it on his armor? It's kind of hard to tell. Anyway, I guess it's not like too important, but there's something going on with Yorm and the hawk. I remember Yorm Bird, because he's really the adjudicator from Demon Souls, but not really. Oh, okay, it's the throne behind him that has like a hawk on it. So it doesn't look like the exact same hawk. Yorm Throne. Yeah, this doesn't have a good close up of it. I found a picture. It's not the best, but oh well, where's... Alright, so there is like this kind of fallen hawk imagery on this. Like I said, not the best, but okay. And then it doesn't quite look like this, but that's kind of like one of the closest ideas that I've had. So this is one of those things where I'd call it like headcanon than anything like super official. And then one of my other headcanons, I guess I won't talk about that just in case Honored Madman brings it up, but yeah. Okay, I'll just leave that there for now.
Seems to line up with me. I mean, Yorm would eventually become the king of the land that his ancestors once ruined, and I can't help but notice that his throne sort of evokes the same image as the thrones of the kings from the DLCs of Dark Souls 2. And just like the kings of Dark Souls 2's DLCs, as well as Vendrick himself, Yorm was sought out by a Shard of Manus. Now, it's unclear if this is a Shard of Manus we've met before. It could be this unseen one named Eleonora, who the axe is named after. It could be Alsana due to a reference about a certain oracle. It's unclear. I like to imagine that it was Alsana. Maybe after Sorik showed up and laid waste to the Ivory City, she fled and found Yorm. But I'll save all that for the Profane Capital video that I have been working on. Either way, either Alsana or an unnamed Shard of Manus or Eleonora, they became a resident of the Profane Capital during Yorm's reign, and their descendants became cruel and selfish, uncaring women. They couldn't give less of a shit about the consequences of their actions or how the said consequences affected those around them. These women would trigger the profane flame and be turned into horrific hand monsters known as monstrosities of sin. Heavily mutated, sure, but they sort of resemble Manus's big hand. So I'd assume that this appearance hints at their dark nature, that they are the descendants of a Shard of Manus, possibly. And as we know, the Shards of Manus were pieces of the original Father of the Abyss that splintered off and broke into separate pieces, if you will, after the protagonist of Dark Souls 1 defeated Manus in his time-traveling shenanigans in the classic DLC, Artorias of the Abyss. Each of the shards slowly became sentient and developed their own personalities based on certain emotions or feelings that once belonged to the Father of the Abyss himself. Nishandra, the main antagonist of Dark Souls 2, represented Manus's want, whereas Alsana, the friendly oracle from the Crown of the Ivory King DLC, represented Manus's fear. And there was two others in Dark Souls 2, Ilana, the squalid queen of Shulva, and Nadalia, the bride of Ash, who bound herself to the lands of the old Iron King, and who the rebel Raim was deeply infatuated with. You know, she gave him a whole new purpose and a will to live again and whatnot. And speaking of the old Ivory King, the reincarnation of Gwyn's most famous knight, Elan, had an army of knights named after him, sort of in his honor. Now, most of these knights just wield a simple katana and bum rush you, but there's also certain captains that wield these great bows. One of these can famously be found on one of the rooftops in Dranley Castle, attempting to mimic the behavior of the Silver Knights of Anor Londo. Now, these guys possessed a very unique great bow. It was very sleek in design, it was sort of silverish, and sure enough, this bow reappears in Dark Souls 3. In fact, it's found in the Profane Capital. Anyway, though, there is a good chance that there is
Interesting. I didn't know that one specifically.
one Shard of Manus that is in Dark Souls 3. Sure, she refers to herself simply as a child of the abyss, so that could go either way, but I'm of course referring to everybody's favorite witch, at least in Dark Souls 3, Carla. Now, we meet Carla not necessarily in the profane capital, but right before it in the dungeons of Irithyll. Now, I used to wonder why the Pontiff Sullivan imprisoned a shard of the Abyss down here, but I mean it makes sense. He's been to the profane capital, so he knows that that great calamity was caused by the actions of a shard of Manus, and he also knows what happened in Dranlaic, as he has that portrait of Nishandra. Yeah, they did have that era of peace that many characterized as being dark-like, but she wasn't ultimately successful in the end. So I think it's safe to say that Pontiff Sullivan recognizes the threat for what it is and doesn't really destroy it because, well, as we learned from Carla's ashes, the Child of the Abyss is never truly destroyed, it just changes form. So he couldn't destroy her, and it could potentially only make her into something more horrifying and strong and harder for him to deal with. So he imprisons her in a cell and leaves her at the...
And that whole, like, reincarnation type thing is kind of lifted from the reincarnating Lord Souls of Dark Souls 2. So Carla kind of like double dips on that idea a little bit.
Mercy of his jailers. Now, speaking of these jailers and the aristocrats and the entire crew of the prison guards that patrols the dungeon, they were all former residents of the profane capital. They're the same people as the handmaids that tend the profane flame, they just have a different job. And while we're on the subject, the profane flame itself, to me at least, seems to be what eventually became of the old chaos, and the handmaids could potentially be former priestesses of Ilium Lois that came with Alsana to the profane capital, if that is indeed what she did. But anyways, back to Carla. It's sort of inherently implied that she is the daughter of Zully the Witch, not the YouTuber, and Alva the Wayfarer from Dark Souls 2. See, Alva was a wandering knight who traveled the world in search of a cure for a saint named Soretta's mysterious illness. And all along the way, he was hounded and harassed by a witch named Zully, who probably found it amusing just trying to stop this knight on this holy quest, or at least in some way corrupt him or whatever. But over time, the two found purpose within each other, and they became sort of this inseparable duo, traveling even as far as the end of the world together. Now, the main two reasons that people believe Carla is Zully and Alva's daughter is that Alva invades shortly before entering the Irithyll dungeon, and that when he's defeated, his gear can be found on a corpse just in front of Carla's cell. And the other reason is from the Dark Blade spell description. It's basically an ancient hex that was passed from mother to daughter as a means of protecting oneself or taking one's life. And when we see Zully in the Ringed City, which I will touch more on just momentarily,
So, the Alva home says, and I guess this might be hearsay, damn it. So, to this day, troubadours sing of tales of the wandering knight Alva and his travels, and of his involvement with the saint and the witch. Needless to say, the songs traditionally end in tragedy. So I wonder what tragedy that means specifically, because I never really thought that Carla would have been their child. I mean, I guess it can make sense because she could have been born before the tragedy happened, but I think there was another thing with Zully that talks about her love being unrequited, essentially. Let me look at Witch real quick. Not that one. The purple hat of the witch Zully, who intended to seduce Alva the Wayfarer, but eventually became his closest supporter, spending her entire life with him. Maybe there's another one. Maybe it's the other mask. Oh, okay. It is said that Zully the witch, who has never loved nor loved another, experienced all manner of misfortune, and yet in the end found her purpose in life. I saw it as a... Yeah, I mean, that's kind of equivalent. So it's the Black Witch garb, which makes it sound like they never would have had a child. Although I guess it does open up a little bit of room for doubt or speculation. Not only because of the it is said, but in the end found her purpose. So I guess it is a little bit open, but I think it's ever so slightly more closed than open to... Anyway.
Main means of attack is the Dark Blade spell. albeit a much more powerful one that sends like a traveling shockwave at you, if only ours did that. But it seems to imply that Zoli was the mother mentioned in the Dark Blade's description of Carla's spell, and to me that's as good a proof as any. Now, we already talked a little bit about the actual Profaned Flame, but what about the Pyromancy Profaned Flame? I mean, it's clearly just a renamed, copied version of the legendary Pyromancy Flame Swathe developed by the all-powerful Strayed of Olaphis. I can't really find many lore reasons for this, only that someone who had knowledge of Flame Swathe just attempted to recreate the same thing, but with the Profaned Flames flames. And this next one is sort of a tenuous reference at best. It's sort of just a similar looking situation. Now, we all know Yorm's room is full of treasure and burnt up corpses, but this amount of treasure has been seen before in a boss room in Dark Souls 2 when you have to fight the twin dragon riders, knights who wielded weapons that required inhuman strength to use, and whose ability to wield these weapons was used as a sort of test for their initiation. What an interesting little fun fact. But yeah, these boss rooms definitely have the same treasure-filled feeling. I don't know if they're meant to be a reference to one another, but they definitely reminded me of one another. And I think that's all of the little references in the Profaned Capital. Oh wait, yeah, the Great Shield of Glory. You know the giant stone shield used by the Drake Keepers at the Dragon Shrine back in Dark Souls 2? Yeah, you can also find that down here as well. And personally, I think it would have been better suited to have been found at maybe Archdragon Peak, but if nothing else, it only adds to the sheer number of Dranlaic Dark Souls 2 references down under.
Yeah, I forgot about the Great Shield of Glory being wielded by the knights, although I may not have, I probably wouldn't have put two and two together because I played DS2 later. Peanut Bobo, welcome back to the stream. Zoli also had the Black Witch Veil, which you got in the Ring City. Yes. So at the very least, though, her garb makes it sound as though she and Alva never really had, they never really had more of a thing. It seemed a bit more like an unrequited love on her part. And then, I did look up Flame Swath, and the kanji is obviously different than the Profane Flame, which is more like the Flame of Sin in Japanese. And then Flame's Swath is essentially like flame hammer. So doesn't really matter. I was just kind of curious. So that's why you guys heard the failure to find something ping
underneath Irithel. Now, moving on to the next location where you might find some Dark Souls 2 references. Now, there's definitely not as many or even close to as many as there was in the Profaned Capital here in Lothric Castle, but there's a couple, in my opinion, quite significant ones. The first is probably the most obvious, and it's the Lion Knight named Albert, who also acted as a summon when you fought Vort if you happened to be embered. And he guards the way alongside a mage and a member of the Black Hand to the Twin Princes boss fight. Now, if you remember the old commercials for Dark Souls 2, you definitely remember this armor set. I mean, they even make figures of this guy. The Farum armor set was arguably the poster child, besides the Scholar of the First Sin version, which used the Forlorn, of Dark Souls 2. Now, I know some will argue that it should have been the Alva set, and maybe it should have. I'm still quite a big fan of the Farum armor. It was said to be the armor of a band of knights called the Lion Knights out of Ferosa, a now ruined land that once was known for birthing several legendary fighters. People like Vengarl, the Ivory King, they all hailed from Ferosa, and this land was known to worship a certain god of war known as Farum. Many people think that this god of war might be the nameless king, the firstborn of the sun, and it is indeed possible. I mean, he's the only god of war we have a mention of, but that's a story for a different day. Albert here wields a golden wing shield, which, fun fact, is the shield that his figure comes with, the smaller one that is. And his association with High Priestess Emma shows that he's sort of a member of the Way of Blue, or rather a Blue Sentinel. Now, the Blue Sentinels were a faction that was introduced to sort of...
Oh no, the pedestal's here. This little shield thing, that's kind of copied in Elden Ring for some of the Crucible style statues that you see in Leyndell and whatnot.
Rather, a Blue Sentinel. Now, the Blue Sentinels were a faction that was introduced to sort of replace the Dark Moon Blades Covenant from Dark Souls 1, but surprisingly, both of these covenants exist in separate forms with separate functions in Dark Souls 3. So I guess the Blue Sentinels are in fact another Dark Souls 2 referenced in Dark Souls 3. They were led by Targray, a rather condescending fellow in the high chapel just beyond the old Dragon Slayer fight in Hyde's Tower of Flame, a land that was most likely founded by Guinevere and her husband Flann. Now anyway, back to the Lion Knight. We know these guys are quite the capable fighters from that cinematic they had in Dark Souls 2, and hilariously enough, I do believe you can find that exact Farum Knight's corpse just buried beneath Dranlake Castle. What a cruel fate for a guy who survived so much. Anyway though, who knows how Albert really wound up out here? I guess it's safe to say that there are still some...
And I know a lot of people are upset that they could never get that version of the mannequin mask in Dark Souls 2, which I mean, it does look pretty sweet to be fair. Scaleezy said, Zoli intended to seduce Alva, but they ended up spending their lives together. You mean, yeah, that could be platonic, but you think most people would see it as romantic? Though unrequited is possible. So part of the reason why I think it's unrequited is also because the Alva set says that the tale is traditionally told in tragedy. So between the description of Zoli's black garb saying that she was never loved, and then Alva set saying that his tale ended in tragedy, probably because he was looking for the saint or whatever, it leads me to be a little bit more skeptical about Carla being their love child. The mannequin redesign is a tragedy. Hey, howdy, how's it going?
Wait, though, who knows how Albert really wound up out here? I guess it's safe to say that there are still some Ferosan Lion Knights out there roaming the land, probably serving as mercenaries in the same vein as the Drang Knights. Although I imagine...
Hold on, I should really rewatch the DS2 vanilla trailer.
Serving as...
Bro, he's got a singular eye like Calamite. That's very interesting.
Mercenaries in the same vein as the Drang Knights. Although I imagine the Ferosan Knights were out there looking for a cause that was worthy to fight for. I mean, that seems to be more in their nature, at least when it comes to people like the Ivory King. I guess Vengarl was just in it for the love of the fight. And I suppose that could be why Lion Knight Albert is here. I mean, maybe he's just here because he loves fighting worthy undead combatants. So the next and admittedly much bigger Dark Souls 2 reference, if it is indeed a Dark Souls 2 reference, has to do with one of the most interesting characters in the entire trilogy, Aldia. So we all know who Aldia is. He's King Vendrick's brother, who sought out an alternate means of circumventing the curse of undead. His brother went his way and Aldia went his own. He carried the titles of a duke and had his own land and fortress, where he and his buddies got up to all sorts of Dr. Moreau-style experiments. For example, you know the Ferosan Lion Knights I mentioned earlier? Well, Aldia, he had a bit of a sense of humor to him, and he wondered what it would be like to turn these self-proclaimed Lion Knights into actual lions. And the result was a ferocious, human-hating lion warrior that, like many of Aldia's...
Oh man, you gotta turn your field of view, or depth of view off.
result was a ferocious, human-hating lion.
Obviously, some of his other footage has been fine, so he figured it out, but...
warrior that, like many of Aldia's creations, wound up encased in stone, or petrified, if you will. Now, there is also a slight reference to these Lion Clan warriors in Dark Souls 3. You can actually get their shield. It's called the War God Wooden Shield, and it sort of loosely confirms the theory that the Lion Knights, or at least a select few of them, were turned into actual lion warriors.
Yeah, and that's been my headcanon for a long time as well, and this is also the kind of connecting piece, the connective tissue of turning the Nameless King as a war god into a named one in Farum, because the Lion Knights could have been Ferosan soldiers, the Ferosan Lion Knights, and they got literally turned into lions, and they worshipped an unnamed war god in Dark Souls 2, but in Dark Souls 3 we learned that unnamed war god's name was Farum. Farum of Ferosa. Blood turned himself into wood, I know, right?
Anyway, though, Aldia, his big thing was peering into the essence of the soul. He wanted to know, the secrets of life itself. And he had other experiments. Most of them were unsuccessful. A couple of them were moderately successful, like the Ancient Dragon or Shanalot, the Emerald Herald. But his biggest success appears to have been removing himself from the cycle of fire completely. Now, doing this horribly mutated him into a root-bound, fiery tree monster. It gave him the ability to manifest himself at just about any bonfire, as he was a part of the First Flame now. He became known as the Scholar of the First Sin, and that title of Scholar is going to become important in a second, as the reference to Aldia in Dark Souls 3 comes from none other than the Grand Archives, which is full of what? Scholars. So in a hidden room behind an illusory wall sits a Outrider Knight. And what is this Outrider Knight guarding? Well, it's a very unique balcony that sort of overlooks a portion of the Grand Archives, and on that balcony lies the corpse of presumably a scholar, and on that corpse you may find the extremely powerful spell Soul Stream. Well, in Dark Souls 2 it was known as Soul Geyser, and it was said to have been a family heirloom of Lord Aldia. Now in Dark Souls 3,
Fun fact, the name is consistent in the Japanese, where you could essentially, for all intents and purposes, call it Soul Geyser in both Dark Souls 2 and 3, but it's just one of those localization fails.
Description is a bit different, I mean they all are. Sorcery imparted by the first of the scholars, when Lothric and the Grand Archives were but young. The first of the scholars doubted the linking of the fire and was alleged to be a private mentor to the royal Prince Lothric himself, and this mysterious first scholar is probably the reason why Prince Lothric has no desire to link the fire himself. I mean, he clearly put the idea in the kid's head from a young age. Now, from those two descriptions and from Aldia's title as the Scholar of the First Sin, it seems like maybe he was the first scholar of Lothric's Grand Archives. And perhaps that's true. I mean, if the flame never truly died, then Aldia never truly died, and he could manifest at any bonfire to essentially force ghost his way into a hero's journey. And as far as doubting the linking of the fire goes, well, I mean, that's sort of, Aldia's MO. He suggests that there's a light route to follow, a dark route to follow, but what about a third route, He also wondered what would happen after an Age of Dark, and that there had to be something that came next. And guess what? These ideas actually made their way into the endings of Dark Souls 3. So in the end, we're presented with 3 options, I guess 4 if you count killing the Firekeeper. The first is through the complicated means of becoming the Lord of Hollows. Now that is one of the coolest endings of all time, don't get me wrong. There's also linking the fire and continuing the cycle, which obviously is the most boring out of all the endings. But there's also a third way. And in this ending, you sort of absorb the fire into your own being and extinguish it. Or at least that's what it seems like's happening. Now we're told from this ending that the darkness will eventually settle and a long Age of Dark...
So, he's also got some text on the screen. You actually don't absorb it, really. You don't know why I said that. The Firekeeper just snuffs it out.
Dark will follow. But eventually, tiny embers will dance across the darkness, eventually becoming a flame of sorts. Now many people interpret this as being the same thing as essentially linking the fire or letting the fire fade. But I don't think so. I think that this is a sort of resetting of things back to the way they were before the events of Dark Souls 1 when Gwyn and all those other guys found the Lord Souls. That fiery inferno where everybody's just, these gangly hollow figures, the beginning, if you will. I think it's not hard to believe that this ending will eventually lead to a newfound beginning of time, if you will, where new individuals might come across these powerful souls and remake the world in a completely different way. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be exactly the same as if we would have just linked the fire or let it fade, It's something new. I like to think, though, that...
So I'm curious what he thinks the difference is between letting the fire fade and this ending specifically, because, I mean, you might be able to argue that letting the fire fade could just, allow the next guy to walk up and link it. Maybe that's in his idea here. But I think this is actually the first time the fire truly fades in the ending of Dark Souls 3, if you choose to do that. And I feel like the Dark Lord ending of Dark Souls 1 is just, not canon, essentially. And why it might not be canon could just because, if you don't link, then Solaire might link in his world, and Solaire could be, the first chosen undead. Even if, he dies in your world, there might be the kind of overlapping between world, because I remember the Crestfallen Warrior talks about how, Logan is a legend from, a bygone era, and so there might be a kind of a duplicity to... not duplicity, but, multiplicity of, the stacked worlds or something like that. I don't know. The Lord of Hollows, aka Why Is Everyone Naked Now ending? They're wearing clothes in the end. Yeah, as Howdy points out, time is convoluted. The meme is no longer a dream.
That's what Aldia was searching for with his third way. And we know that Vendrick also sought out a third way. His was just a little bit different from Aldia's, and it involved gathering the crowns of these powerful kings who had also fallen and basically combining them to make a super crown that stopped you from hollowing. But this hardly circumvented the curse for all mankind, and Aldia's research, while brutal and kind of horrific, had the noble goal of freeing humanity from the curse of the undead, something that is finally achievable due to Dark Souls 3's various endings. And we also know Vendrick's way would be famously copied by a giant skeleton named Wolnir. A lot of good that did him in the end to save his kingdom from falling to the abyss and being destroyed by overzealous Artorias cosplayers. Anyway, though, back to this mysterious first scholar. Now, I guess it is possible for him to have simply been Aldia. We just talked about that. Personally, I like to think that he passed Soul Geyser down to his most trusted student and disciple. And when it comes to this hypothetical student, I think that there's really only two possible candidates. I mean, there's, I guess, countless, but there's only two fun candidates. The first is obviously Pontiff Sullivan. We've talked before about how Aldia created the Forlorn and basically stripped them of a home to return to, bound a few of them to his house to act as guard dogs, and seemingly abandoned the rest to their fates. Well, I've always thought it possible that they found their home in the Painted World, if you will, as it's always been referred to as a home of the Forlorn. And not to mention that both the inhabitants of the Painted World and the Forlorn themselves are quite fond of scythes. Anyway, it's possible that Pontiff came into contact with Aldia in some way or form. Perhaps he found Aldia's research, perhaps Aldia manifested himself at a bonfire to him. And we do know that, Pontiff is half tree. I mean, his mom was one of those weeping trees that we see in the Painted World. So maybe Aldia felt a sense of kinship with him. And that is, of course...
Well, that's kind of a funny connection between them, because like Aldia is kind of a tree, these ladies are kind of trees, Sullivan is kind of tree. Like at first I was like, well, whatever, I don't really like buy it, but that kind of makes it a bit more tangible to me. So I'm a little bit more on board with that theory than I would have initially expected. Albigade says, this is why you like the fire fading ending of DS3 the most. Think Lord of Hollows is way overrated. It repeats all of Gwyn's mistakes with the cruelest humans taking the lead. Except for the whole slavery thing, but yeah.
Of course, following the theory that Pontiff is the mysterious first scholar, but I don't think that that's so set in stone either. Now, I can only think of one other individual who would be considered Aldia's disciple, and that's the bearer of the curse from Dark Souls 2. So I'm proposing that it's possible that maybe the bearer of the curse, after walking away from the Throne of Want back in Dark Souls 2, eventually became the first scholar of Lothric's Grand Archives and doubted the Link of Fire because, well, he saw the pointlessness to it. He saw it just continued the same cycle that enslaved humanity, and why should we play ball with that?
So yeah, that's also a fair reading. But to be fair, I don't think you'd really be the first scholar if you were like Aldia's student. Although I guess first scholar in this set of circumstances could be like the first scholar of the Regal Archives, I guess. I don't know. It's a little bit weird. I think the most likely candidate is Aldia, and it's just supposed to be a little bit more of a nod than anything like real. It is kind of frustrating that some of the most pivotal characters in the previous games don't have a real appearance or real comments about what became of their fates. Now, not every character needs that to have happened, because obviously different ages of time have passed, however many hundreds or thousands of years, and it's only natural for people to fade out of memory. But with Aldia being decisively like non-human at like this stage of his career and more of a tree, I think a natural assumption that many people would make would be that he may have had a elongated life, because trees are known for being long-lived, but also many trees aren't on fire for very long before they die either. So who's really to say? And aside from him, we also have Koth who died if you kill Yuria. She says in the Japanese that more or less she failed to fulfill Koth's dying wishes. So, while Koth obviously doesn't appear in DS2, that kind of makes more sense because you're in a different location. But it's very interesting that he gets roped back into things only to get roped out of things in Dark Souls 3 and Yuria's death dialogue there. Howdy asks, is the Throne of Want the kiln, or does the Throne of Want take you to where you want to go? So the second part is kind of true. I don't know if it like literally takes you there, but as far as like sitting on the throne is concerned, it's said to show the person who sits on it what essentially they want. And so if you want to become like part of the first flame, it should presumably like show you the way to make that happen. And so that might be how you like link from a distance. So it could just be like a telephone to linking the first flame for all we know. So yeah, those are really good questions though. Yeah, and as Scally says, they see it as another connection point to the first flame. And that's kind of what it seems to hint at least with like the weird Lord Thrones in DS3 and like taking everyone's flame so that way you could go up to the flame and link it. I don't know. It's a little bit awkward the way that it was fully implemented, but what are you going to do about that?
I mean, we know at least by the end of Dark Souls 2, the bearer of the curse was Aldia's closest confidant. I think it's highly likely that he would have left him the Soul Geyser spell to sort of carry on his legacy. I don't know, that's just my theory when it comes to Aldia being the first scholar. I definitely think it's possible he might have also influenced the mind of the first scholar. He might have been their mentor in the same way that the first scholar was Lothric's mentor. There's a lot of possibilities there, but I've spent enough time talking about Aldia and Pontiff when I need to do their own respective videos.
And there might be another possibility with like the Crystal Sages somehow, because one of them went to the archives. But yeah, I don't know. I think Aldia is like the easiest answer, but just because it's the easiest, that doesn't make it the most correct either. Howdy says the endings in DS2 are neither snuffing out the flame or embracing it, but isn't walking away from the flame and not doing anything about it, letting the flame die. That's kind of been my interpretation. And so Dark Souls 2 is left open because they only really had one ending, in that you kind of have to figure out the answer for yourself. So it's kind of a bit of a cop-out for really giving us the details of whether or not linking like restores things, or if like letting the fire fade is what the bearer of the curse desires, which I think the general idea is that you're more likely to link, because otherwise if you don't link and do nothing, you just become another Vendrick, which might have happened, but I mean, if we don't link, apparently somebody else will just come up and link anyway. I don't know.
But now moving on to the Dark Souls 2 references of the famous DLC, The Ringed City, starting with one of my favorite locations.
This. It's not in bad shape.
Now, the Dreadkeep is essentially the end of the world. It's a place where the lands of all the previous ages and times are converging into one giant ball of lands. So I suppose it's not that surprising that there'd be at least one location straight out of Dark Souls 2 to be found here. And strangely enough, it's the world-famous Earthen Peak that found its way into the Dreadkeep, or at least to one of the explorable portions of the Dreadkeep.
So Howdy asks, was Vendrick a chosen undead? That's a very good question, and in many ways the answer should be no, because he has so many people go off to fight the undead, so it'd be a little bit hypocritical for him to have been undead and like went in to avoid all the undead and stuff. But to be fair, like those like undead hunts were more of a byproduct of previous rulers, like the Old Iron King, whom Vendrick crushed. So in some ways, you probably can compare him more to a bearer of the curse or chosen undead, because he does kind of defeat all the previous lords and builds his own kingdom, but he doesn't link for whatever reason. And if you want to argue that Vendrick isn't supposed to be like an undead. I mean, that is kind of how he ultimately ends up, just as a gigantic hollow, which isn't too dissimilar from Gwyn, but he just kind of abdicated his throne and was letting the flame fade, but he wasn't necessarily like snuffing it out or consuming it like Nishandra would have wanted. Because like the irony of Nishandra is because her thirst and her desire is insatiable or unquenchable, she would try to consume the flame directly or like hold on to it and whatnot and probably end up burning herself in the process. And you could argue that what Vendrick did by locking Nishandra away from it was a way of protecting her, and Vendrick was kind of a victim of his own love, and he was too terrified of Nishandra's true nature to face her, and also too scared to confront fate and deny her at the same time. So he was a king who made no choice, which made him not a king at all according to like the lore of Dark Souls 2, and like Dark Souls 3 kind of hints that he was a king, but not really. And so that's just kind of one of the aspects of his character, which I find like fascinating. And I think it's one of the more fascinating, like value judgments given of a character in like the FromSoft games, where like they don't really make a lot of value judgments about the actions that the characters do pretty much ever. But Vendrick failed to be a true lord and whatnot because he really did fail to make a choice. And so that's kind of like the meta commentary that I feel like the game is making, where like if you don't seize your own fate and let it just kind of pass you by passively, that's worse than trying to deny your fate entirely. So what's the shield in like Bloodborne say? It's like shields engender passivity, and yeah, so that's kind of like not the exact quote that I was trying to use right there, but anyway, yeah, either embrace your fate or reject it. Don't just sit it and let it pass you by. That's the moral of the story there. The Vendrick reveal was a highlight of DS2. Yeah, definitely, I would definitely agree with that. Scowleezy says, Chosen Undead are specific to the prophecy of linking the fire. Might have ended after DS1, but the snakes and gods could have brought the prophecy back once the fire started fading again. So yeah, I don't literally think like he's a chosen undead. I think he's just like the analog of what a chosen undead was as far as DS2 is concerned. And yeah, I'll just leave it there. Vendrick could have been chosen by the serpents to link the fire, but the original prophecy was contingent on ringing the bells and obtaining the Lord Vessel. So, I mean, there are the two bell towers, so we know that the Old Iron King like combined the two lands, and then Vendrick overthrew the Old Iron King and everything, so maybe he did ring the bells, who's to say?
Complete with some of its previous occupants, the Poison Broomers, and of course one solitary, lovely desert pyromancer by the name of Zoe, who has unsurprisingly enthralled two hollow slaves to follow her around like dogs. Now, I can't think of many lore reasons for it being included other than they just wanted to reference one of the more, I guess, iconic locations from Dark Souls 2, but personally, I think that Miyazaki wanted to do that while also being able to bring in yet another poison toxic swamp, specifically doing a remix of one that he actually didn't get to work on because, you know, he probably wanted to work on it, so he's like, you know, I'll remix it and flip it for the DLC of Dark Souls 3.
The swamp
That's
lore.
why I believe the Earthen Peak of all places was included, but I'm not unhappy with it. I actually love the aesthetic of that section of the Dreadkeep. And honestly, I'm just really glad that we were able to get that Desert Pyromancer set in Dark Souls 3. I mean, who isn't? Now, on to the Ring City proper, which doesn't have as many Dark Souls 2 references as you'd think, but it does have some sort of sad ones, in my opinion. So when you first show up at the Ring City, you're greeted by the howl of an adjudicator giant, and you soon learn that the howl summoned the orange spirits of several Ruin Knights to defend it by firing arrows at you. Now, these Ruin Knights were originally a group of knights that was set off to go find the Dark Soul by some old king. Now, that old king could have been Vendrick or some predecessor of his, perhaps the King of Olafis or maybe the Old Iron King. But they eventually found the Ringed City. Unfortunately, they also found the Judicator Giants, who swiftly defeated them and bound them to a sort of eternal servitude as defense.
Right. So Scalise asks, wait, did Vendrick even link the fire? He didn't go hollow until he separated his soul from his body, right? If he did link it, why didn't he get all burnt out? So no, Vendrick definitely did not link the flame. So that's part of why he isn't a true lord or a true king or true monarch. I don't remember what the English calls him specifically, but yeah. He did not link. He ran away from his fate and locked himself away from Nishandra because he realized like the true nature of the darkness within her, and he got scared. And he also got scared at his culmination of power and the way that like she used love to blind him. And so his only option was, because of his love of Nishandra, he couldn't link the flame because I think in his mind he thought like linking the flame would also rid him of her. And then he also couldn't let her eat the flame because the flame would probably consume her like it would consume pretty much everything else. So he just kind of had to lock it all away and just run away from his problems. So yeah, his tragedy is that he was a king who could not make a decision, and that's like the biggest no for like a FromSoft game.
Vendors of
And of course, like that is my interpretation, and others might have differing thoughts on that as well.
the city that they sought out. In Dark Souls 2, we have several ruined sentinels, which are sort of golems, empty suits of armor that are used as defenders and sentinels in various locations, like at the Lost Bastille and Dranlake Castle. These were built in honor and memory of the ruined knights who had long since disappeared and never returned, and it supposedly also inspired a certain dark fable. Now, the ruined knights aren't the Adjudicator Giants' only spirit summon. They also seem to have bound the famous Zoli the Witch to their cause. I mean, who knows how? We know that Alva was at least in some way watching over his daughter Carla down in Irithyll prison, but where's Zoli? Well, it turns out she found her way to the Ring City just beyond the end of the world, and was presumably forced into service by the Judicator Giants, similar to how the Ruined Knights were. Alva, for his trouble, after I imagine finding out that Carla was going to be safe and okay down at the Firelink Shrine, headed off to find Zoli. And after presumably months and months of searching, he finally tracks her down to the Ring City. He makes his way there and finds her spirit unfortunately bound as a protector of this land and her corporeal form destroyed. So Alva, with nothing else to do at this point, just decides to defend the remains of his lover Zoli. And you gotta give it to him, the guy managed to avoid the same fate as Zoli and the Ruined Knights. He didn't get bound into service. He's still operating with his own agency down in the Ring City, doing what he wants to do. And to me, that's just proof that Alva is a tough son of a bitch. I mean, he's also a tragic one, sure, but that's an impressive feat.
Yeah, and I was going to say, this is probably like the culmination of the tragedy of the story, if that is how it's supposed to canonically end. I do know that the Silver Knight Leto also became like bound. Well, is he real Silver Knight? Maybe he is. Anyway, he also befriended the Adjudicator Knights, but didn't fully seem to like die like Zoli. So there could be the possibility that Zoli also willingly got herself bound to the Adjudicator. Although I don't remember if they made it clear that like Leto was the exception or not. There might have been something like that. It kind of sounds familiar, but I just don't remember exactly off the top of my head. So anyway, don't really have too much else to say about that.
In my opinion, to be able to not wind up as one of those orange spirit summons that the Giants use. So now that we're out of the ones I had grouped into specific locations, we're going to sort of rapid fire a few more. A lot of these I kind of discovered while I was going through clips to make this video, so here they are. That's why they're in a rapid fire form. Now, do you remember Benhart? He was arguably the best friend a player character could ask for in Dark Souls 2 besides Lucatil. And his spirits were never broken. He was always there to lend a hand, and this guy was probably most famous for his sword. He had a fake Moonlight Greatsword known as the Blue Moon Greatsword. The guy proudly wields it as it's his family heirloom, and it's actually pretty damn useful. You'd think a weapon that's just a fake copy of a magic sword wouldn't be worth a damn in most RPGs, and you'd probably be right. And I think that's what makes the Blue Moon Greatsword so cool, is that it's not useless. It seems specifically designed for those who like the look of the Moonlight Greatsword but don't have the intelligence to wield it. Now, unfortunately, Benhart's gear doesn't really appear in the game. You could kind of make a makeshift version of it. But as we all know, Benhart was from Jugo, and the armor he wore was from Mira because he looted it when he first came to Dranlaic. And among those things is the Elkhorn Shield, something that's still available in Dark Souls 3. It's just a damn shame his armor and his sword aren't available, because honestly, the Blue Moon Greatsword was a genius idea. The only drawback was, I believe, its low durability. And now that I'm realizing it, most of these are in fact shields. The next shield is the Stone Parma, which was wielded by the horse-headed stone statue knights found in Dranlaic Castle, protecting the way leading up to the Looking Glass
Oh, that's a
Knight.
good one.
Now, I really like these enemies' designs, and I really like their stone weapons, but I'm at least happy they got a slight reference in Dark Souls 3 with their shield, which I'm not really a shield guy, but if I was, that'd probably be one of the ones I'd like to try out. Then we've got the Eastern Iron Shield, which was once referred to as the Iron Parma back in Dark Souls 2. Now, there's not much lore behind that, but that's still technically a Dark Souls 2 reference.
Another
Same
good
with the Spirit
observation.
Tree Shield. There's not much, lore or backstory there. It's just a returning item from the previous game. Now, I know you're probably tired of shields by this point, so we're on the last one. But my favorite shield from Dark Souls 2 that returns in Dark Souls 3 is definitely the Golden Falcon. Now, this shield was made famous by the infamous Falconers of Dark Souls 2. Probably one of the most memorable enemies of the game, and not because they're found anywhere or do anything really all that interesting. I mean, they've got pretty good aim with their bows, and they're
They've
not
got
bad
that
with
goofy
those swords
animation.
that we can't obtain, but that's not it. Now, their most memorable feature is the hilarious run animation that they have that was not fixed in Scholar of the First Sin, and is probably the reason we don't see these guys in more places throughout the game. Now, I think their lore was actually pretty cool. They come from a land that is known for having a very weak army. Volgan, I believe it's called, which is where the Merchant, I think, is from in Dark Souls 2. Anyway, this country's standing army was extremely weak, so they hired a very capable and brutally efficient group of mercenaries known as the Volgan Falconers. Now, these guys, like I said, were ruthlessly efficient and were consummate mercenaries through and through. They were entrusting of others, demanding of prompt full payment, but no wonder. I mean, they delivered much more than they are paid for and are well aware of it. And that's literally from the description of their shield back in Dark Souls 2. So these guys were like the top tier mercenaries of the era. And in Dark Souls 3, they are deservingly remembered by mercenaries everywhere for their legendary status. Though the name of their company has been forgotten, the symbol of it lives on in the form of this shield. And
I think it'd be really cool to just have a little bit more context as to how these dudes who were like in mercenary bands or just like who were all like badass in their prime, like what they actually would have like really looked like as a group or a culture or a civilization. Just because like we get the backstories, but we don't ever really get the side of it to really understand what exactly that means, which I don't know. It's a little bit bittersweet, I think. So, anyway.
Even to this day, many mercenaries look at this shield as a sign of good fortune. I mean, it makes sense. The Volgan Falconers understood what it meant to be a badass mercenary. And sure, that was only because Volgan's own military was extremely weak, but it allowed these Falconers to shine. But anyway, let's move on to the next one. I've wasted enough time talking about these guys. So the mannequin claws also make a reappearance in Dark Souls 3. If you remember these things, they were wielded by the mannequins from Earthen Peak back in Dark Souls 2. I mean, unfortunately, the mannequin saber wasn't included. That was probably my favorite sword, or at least curved sword in the game. Instead, we just get these stupid claws, which are wielded by the Londor Pale Shade, who wears a mask that isn't quite a mannequin mask. It's too, it's showing too much expression. But it's a little more evidence to my theory that the Londor Sable Church absorbed the mannequins and the suspicious shadows. And
no, I didn't realize that there was a tree on the Londor Pale Shade set. Should probably look at it a bit more.
A lot of that stuff from Dark Souls 2 wound up under the Sable Church. I mean, that's just a theory, but let's move on. So the Spotted Whip from the famous Seaman of Dong boss also returns and is referred to as a weapon used by the female pyromancers of the Great Swamp. And we know that the desert pyromancers also liked using whips later on, as we see with Zoe. This one seems like one of the more random entries in the game. I mean, out of all the whips they picked, why this one? It could have been the bloodied whip, which was probably impossible damn near to get, or my personal favorite, the old whip, which hit like a truck but also broke really easily. But I suppose I'm just like splitting hairs at this point. Although I guess the Shrine of Amana was technically swamp. But there were no female pyromancers there. There were only those male ones who I'm pretty sure are probably the strongest, smartest, and most capable enemies in the entire game. I'm going to do a whole video about those guys. The hollow pyromancers underneath the flame in the Shrine of Amana.
It's kind of an interesting point. Yeah, those dudes are pretty tough. Are they like the toughest? That's interesting. I need to think about that one a bit more.
Holy shit. But I guess if you know the spotted whip comes from the tongue of frog demons, it's possible that there's just some of them there at the Great Swamp as well, so that their tongues could be harvested by the more powerful than male female pyromancers of the Great Swamp. It's in the lore that female pyromancers are stronger. So
Stella, you know what a spoonerism is when you like switch the first syllables around of like two different words? That's what happens when you get the Demon of Song.
Just be glad there's no Amana female pyromancers. Anyways though, speaking of pyromancy, now one of my favorite pyromancies returns to Dark Souls 3 from Dark Souls 2, and it's got a new description. I'm of course talking about Warmth, one of the more interesting forms of fire magic in the game, a fire that heals. But it doesn't just heal you, it heals anything that steps into its vicinity.
Mountain Makers.
Now this was a trademarked pyromancy of the Grave Wardens way back in the day of Dark Souls 2. Nowadays in Dark Souls 3 it's been adopted and repurposed by the Mountain Makers, a group of insane hollows who just live for the thrill of the kill. And it makes sense. I mean, they're purple phantoms. They can attack any phantom and be attacked by anything, so of course they would use a spell that heals just about anything as well. And
So there is a point of difference about that I would like to highlight, in that while it's certainly true that they kind of killed to their heart's content, their purpose of it was to increase the members of their family. Now, family here might be a bit more metaphorical language. Like, I don't really think they mean to... Well, actually, I guess I could see it. But anyway, I don't really think they mean to, like, imply that killing somebody, like, makes them your son or daughter or anything like that. But in a more metaphorical sense, if you kill somebody and you take their souls and they become part of you, then they're kind of, in a certain way, part of your family because they are you. So by continuing to kill others, you are effectively making them part of your family. So it becomes a duty to you and your family to continue to live. And so I think it was a way for them to artificially create their own never-ending duty, so that way they never went fully mad and fully hollow, because they were scared of the shackles of the gods slipping or being removed from them, which is coded language for life in general, which ties back into my latest video about with Vendrick and Aldia were talking about, where life was forced upon them, and it was the yoke that was thrust upon them by the gods, essentially. So, yeah, very important stuff, but anyway.
The last entries we're going to cover that I surprisingly didn't fit into any of the other sections is the Drakeblood Knights. So these guys were led way before the events of Dark Souls 2 by a guy named Sir Jorg. These guys laid siege on the Eternal Sanctum deep beneath the lands of Dranlaig, but sunk into the sanctum itself when they accidentally woke the sleeping dragon they were hunting for. Now, it was said that the red cloth wrapped around their armor was said to signify the blood of the dragons, which they worshipped, and they believed that if they obtained the dragon blood that they worshipped so much, that it would grant them a type of enlightenment, a true understanding of life, transcending their banal existence. So it's unsurprising then that the Drakeblood Knights eventually wound up in Archdragon Peak, a place where all those who worship the dragons and wish they could be dragons wound up. I mean, you have the little reindeer dragon guys, the serpent men from Dark Souls 1, and guys like Havel, who I'm pretty sure was on the side of the dragons, he just hated Seath. The Nameless King, famous friend of dragons, and his #1 student Ornstein, the former dragon slayer, they all wound up in this place. It's not surprising that a group of dudes who thought that dragon blood allowed them enlightenment would end up here as well, although their presence here seems to be a bit different than the others. See, they're summoned as defenders of this land by a weird-looking sorcerer who's also capable of summoning Rykard from Dark Souls 1 and Havel, or at the very least, a Havel Knight. And
when he said Rykard instead of Rickard, I was like, what? I was thinking of the snake from Elden Ring.
sure, the spellcasters do look a little bit like the ones you find in Brightstone Cove, Seldora, back in Dark Souls 2, but I don't think there's a connection there. I mean, I bet the Drakeblood Knights are enjoying it. They probably thought they would never get to see the skies again. You know, like, Jorg led them down there to claim the blood of the slumbering dragon, and when he stabbed that dragon, it blew a cloud of gas that basically killed Jorg instantly and brought ruin to the whole Eternal Sanctum, trapping a huge number of Drakeblood Knights down there underneath the land with Sin and Shulva and Ilana and all of that good stuff. Those who managed to escape this ill-fated expedition went on to form the Archdrake sect and were very secretive about their miracles and pretty much all of their knowledge, but that probably mainly had to do with them wanting to conceal their, their ill-fated voyage. They probably don't want anybody to make the same mistake as them, but at the same time, they probably don't want anybody else to claim the dragon if they couldn't. They don't want anybody else to have that knowledge. They're associated with Lindel, which I like to believe is where Anor Londo was currently located, at least during the events of Dark Souls 2, so maybe there's something more there. Perhaps it deserves a little bit more research. Anyways, though, this one I can't believe I almost forgot about mentioning. Mainly it's because I mistakenly thought the Silver Cat Ring was also a thing from Dark Souls 1, but the Silver Cat Ring straight up references Sweet Shalquar, a sarcastic and lovable cat who is actually said to be some sort of ancient goddess that's taking the form as an immortal cat. I've always believed she could be Velka, but then again, anybody could be Velka. But yeah, just judging by this description alone, I mean, it has to be her. Who else could it be? And on top of that, I'm pretty sure she sold the Silver Cat Ring back in Dark Souls 2, so
she did,
seems
yeah.
to line up. The only thing I disagree with is that it says she spoke with the voice of an old woman, and that's just straight up not true, at least in the American version. She was voiced by Hannah John Kamen, I believe. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that last name right, but it was an attempt. And she's not old at all. She's probably early 30s at the oldest. So that was kind of an odd choice of a description, although I imagine she was probably voiced by an older actress in some of the other dubs.
So I wonder if he's forgetting about Alvina and if it's supposed to be more of a reference to her, because Alvina is, a bit more white than Shalqua over here. So don't forget the Undead Bones Hard. Yeah. You totally missed and forgot that the Drakeblood sect became the Archdrake sect. Yes, and in Dark Souls 1 as well, there was the kind of idea of dragons being able to transcend reality or something like that. I think that was mentioned in like the Dragon Stone Head or Dragon Headstone and or Torso. So there's something in DS1 like that, but DS2 definitely expands on it, and then DS3 continues moving that forward. Even if the Nameless King was following the path of the dragon, he should have become at least a little bit draconic by now. More likely he's just allied with the dragons and the bell is to challenge to fight him? Maybe.
Now this description also gives us a little bit of insight into Shalquar's origins. It says that she came from either the Age of Gods or right after it. And given her infinite knowledge of figures like Gwen, tell me she probably existed either amongst them and was reincarnated like they were. But either way, that makes her like the oldest living being in Dark Souls 2 as something that was around during the Age of Gods, or like it said, right after. And even if she did exist, right after that first Age of Fire or whatever, she would still be quite ancient, as Dark Souls 2 takes place many thousands of years after those first couple cycles. But the new description of the Silver Cat Ring sort of calls into question the old description, which says something along the lines of when cats grow old, another force brews within them, and they're reborn as something new. So that could be more evidence that she was a god during the Age of Gods and was reincarnated shortly after like the old ones were. So again, it's a nice little follow-up to something that was subtly quite important back in Dark Souls 2. But anyways, though, I like how it describes Shalquar as a fanciful immortal, because that's really what she was. She had a wealth of knowledge about all of the old ones and even stuff from before their time, like stuff about Gwen calling him a liar. Hands down, one of the best characters in Dark Souls 2. I mean, she says she's leaving at the end because you've beaten the game, but she never actually leaves, so that's pretty cool. But yeah, I can't believe I almost forgot that one. Now, before I close off, there are a couple of areas that reminded me of places from Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3, and they might not be the same place at all, but I might as well mention them. Now, this first one is probably definitely not the case. See, when I first went down into the profane capital and I noticed all those weird looking statues like the ones they have holding the bowl for the profane flame, it instantly reminded me of the Dragon Wall in Shulva with all those statues. Now, I don't think they're the same place or anything, but it is interesting that Ilana does in fact use Flame Swathe, which would become the Profaned Flame.
That's kind of fun. It's also a little bit weird that in the profane capital, you've got the dudes that have like mortars attached to them, essentially, like the statue dudes. They just have like, yeah. Anyway,
Now, the other one is just Archdragon Peak. I believe Archdragon Peak might be the same place, just many years later, as the Dragon Area and Dragon Shrine. Now, sure, the architecture is pretty different, and there's a lot of different statues, and most of it is kind of just got the same color to it as Archdragon Peak, not really the same architectural design or even its defenders. But even then, I can't help but think there has to be some connection between those two places. I'll probably save that for a video. I mean, I'm working on like a million ideas at once, it seems like. But that one and an idea that a friend gave me about sheer...
so this isn't related to Dark Souls at all, but I saw the headline today, and this just reminded me of it. Apparently, there's like this part of India where the people there were worshiping these kind of stones, and they like would draw faces on them, and they believed like they would protect like their families and stuff like that, and they turned out to be literally fossilized dinosaur eggs. I almost said dragon eggs because we're looking at dragon eggs, but yeah, just fossilized dinosaur eggs casually worshipped by people in India for protection. So that was just kind of a, yeah, it just reminded me of that. You saw that? Nice.
His parentage might be coming a lot sooner than the rest. Anyway, though, I think that was all of the references I wanted to cover that are in Dark Souls 3 from Dark Souls 2. Now, undoubtedly, I probably missed a couple, even as hard as I tried to find all of them. So please share with me any of the ones I either got wrong or missed in the comments, because that would really help out, and it would help out the viewers too. But yeah, like I said at the start of the video, I know Dark Souls 3 has way more Dark Souls 1 references in it than it does 2. To say that Dark Souls 3 ignored Dark Souls 2 or that Dark Souls 2 isn't canon is just a straight up lie.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, that's just all there is to it. But anyway, though, guys, I hope you found this video to be at least somewhat amusing or informative or entertaining. And if you liked it, please consider liking it. If you disliked it, please dislike it. And if you like hearing me ramble on at varying lengths of time about varying different video gamey topics, please consider subscribing. We cracked 18K and we're on our way to 19 now.
Nice.
Blown away by what many call the support. Anyway, though, enough of that. Let's have our outro and then some hints about the upcoming projects then, shall we?
Alright, so this was another really good video. Definitely shared some things that I wasn't aware of, because I'm really bad at, damn it, like a lot of the visual stuff between Dark Souls 2 especially. But there were a couple things that could potentially be related, but might not exactly be related between Dark Souls 2 and 3. One of the funnier ones is the Prisoner's Chain of like the embedded in Dark Souls 2. It has pretty much the exact same icon as the chain that you get from Champion Gundyr and his fight if you transpose his soul. Another thing is, let me take note. From Dark Souls 2, there's something else. What was I looking at? That wasn't it. I'm losing it. Oh yeah, all the stuff relating to Havel, because I know in Dark Souls 2, I mean Havel is originally in Dark Souls 1, so it's really easy to say like the Havels that appear in Dark Souls 3 are just references to Dark Souls 1, but I don't necessarily think that's the case. And there is a little bit more stuff with like Leto relating to Havel, but I guess that isn't as much like DS2. Um was there really anything else? I thought there was, but I'm kind of blanking. But yeah, anyway, that was like a really good list that I appreciate. Man, I really thought there was like one other thing that I wanted to mention, but I just didn't take note of it. Okay, anyway, going back to the video.
Holy shit, I really did not expect this reference video to end up being this long, but here we are at like an hour and 5 minutes, huh? But yeah, sorry for like the 2-week delay. I had a lot of internet problems this past week, which is really getting on my nerves. Plus, I had a lot of struggling with which video to finish, and then when this one became this length, it sort of took longer than planned. But anyway, the next couple videos should come out really soon. There's a couple, non-lore videos I'm doing. One about the Daryl Dixon series, because I did watch it. And another about those Fallout leaks that if you're watching my Instagram, I've been working on, or not working on, but talking about doing a video about those for a while. So yeah, those two should be next. Then we got some more lore stuff, like a video on the Corvians, one on the ghouls of Fallout, and maybe I'll finally finish that Black Noir video now that Gen Z is out and doing pretty good. As always, though, I'll be seeing you guys real soon, and I hope you've had a good one. See you next time. Be safe.
All right, so I have already linked the video into chat for you guys if you want it. It's called Commitment. Sometimes it be that way. So yeah, if you want to give Honored Madman a like and a sub, feel free to do so. I'm going to leave a comment that the oracles mentioned in the profaned capital use different kanji than what's used for Alsana in DS2. There's also the potential, well, maybe not. Although they don't really seem related, the icons for the prisoner's chain for Gundyr and the embedded ring thing in DS2 are virtually identical. And man, I really wish I remembered the last thing that I wanted to say. By the way, I also have been streaming reactions to some of your videos here on YouTube. You should be able to find them by checking out your mentions tab. I appreciate the videos. There were definitely some references that I missed, so good job on the work. So good job. So good job. So well done. Looking forward to more. All right, good enough. Alright, so I went ahead and left a like, a sub, and a comment live on stream. And this time I did it when I was not muted, for once. Alright, everybody. Well, that will pretty much conclude the stream for tonight. Went a little bit over time because I, have been talking too much. But anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Yeah. Okay. For tomorrow, I'm not actually going to stream. I realized I should have mentioned this earlier in the chat, and I kept like forgetting to do it because I didn't like talk over anybody. So that's a bit of my mistake. But I'm not going to stream tomorrow because it's New Year's Eve, and honestly, I don't really care about like celebrating it that much. But the fireworks really freak out my dog, and I don't want to have to deal with streaming and like trying to console him. So I will skip tomorrow, and then I will stream again on the 1st itself. So everybody stay safe till then. Make sure you have all your fingers by the next time we come into stream. Take care, stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you then. Last Protagonist out.